Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The Body. Hidden in the heart of the forest. It all began on a misty morning in Pinewood Forest, where sunlight had yet to pierce through the ancient canopy of towering trees. The forest, long known for its silence and eerie aura, had remained largely untouched, avoided by locals and travelers alike due to stories shrouded in mystery, stories no one could ever explain. But this time, the death of a young woman had drawn curious eyes from the outside world into its haunting embrace. Ava, an investigative journalist from Seattle, had been assigned to uncover the truth behind this strange death. The victim's name was Lily, a university student found in the forest early the previous morning. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood on the ground, just 3 deep stab wounds across her chest and one final thrust into her abdomen. The stabs weren't random. They were precise, deliberate, and placed in locations that no one could logically explain. Each wound felt like a symbol. But a symbol of what? Eva didn't believe in the strange folklore that locals whispered about Pinewood Forest. But the moment she stepped beneath those looming trees, something felt different. A creeping chill blanketed the air. The atmosphere felt frozen in time, suspended in an unsettling silence. The towering pines seemed to watch her every step. The forest itself breathed, but not with life, with something else, something unseen, something felt. When the investigation team discovered Lily's body, everything became even more obscure. She lay there on the cold forest floor, her eyes wide open in terror, as if she had seen something in her final moments, something unimaginable. Ava stood near the body, carefully documenting details while her colleagues gathered evidence. But then it happened, something Ava never expected. As she leaned closer to the body, a sudden gust of cold wind brushed past her. Even though there was no wind in the forest, she heard a faint breath, soft, right behind her. She turned quickly. No one. An invisible chill wrapped around her like a cloak. From that moment on, Eva felt it. Something wasn't right. She decided to continue the investigation, unaware that her choice would drag her into a terrifying confrontation with forces far beyond her understanding. When Eva met Dr. Sarah Donnelly, a renowned psychologist specializing in paranormal phenomena, everything began to unravel. Sarah, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with a stern face and quiet intensity, agreed to assist Eva with the case. But she warned her, "Eva, I've studied many strange cases, but this is unlike anything I've ever seen," Sarah said, sitting across from her in a quiet cafe. "The stab wounds on Lily's body, they're not just from some killer. They may be part of an ancient ritual we've yet to comprehend." Eva didn't fully understand, but there was something about Sarah's tone that made it impossible to dismiss. An ancient ritual? Are you saying what happened here could be some kind of curse? Sarah's gaze drifted, as though seeing something far away, something lost to time. "Not just a curse," she whispered. "Pinewood Forest was once the site of strange rites, centuries ago. Lily's death may be only the beginning of something far more terrifying." Throughout the conversation, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was listening, watching. As she left the cafe, the air outside felt heavier than before. Streetlights flickered, and out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a shadow moving through the darkness. She turned. Nothing. But the feeling remained. Things grew more complicated when Ava met Detective David Walker, a firm believer in logic and reason, hardened by years of chasing criminals. David didn't buy into folklore or ghost stories. He believed Lily's death might have stemmed from a romantic entanglement turned violent. "We'll find the truth, even if it costs us everything," David said as they stood in front of Lily's old house. Inside, they found an old photograph of Lily, standing in front of a forest. At first glance, nothing unusual, but behind her, barely visible, was a shadowy figure, unclear, almost transparent, like a ghost watching from the trees. Eva's skin prickled. Something about the photo felt wrong. She couldn't shake the sense that Lily's death was just the opening chapter in a much darker story, one that hadn't yet revealed itself. What was waiting for them in Pinewood Forest? And did they have the strength to face a force that science could not explain? Every step Ava took seemed to draw her closer to the truth, but also deeper into the darkness, a place where there would be no turning back. The torrential rain poured down on the Pinewood Forest that afternoon, as if it were trying to hide everything happening beneath the canopy. Ava felt as though the world around her was slowly unraveling. She and Detective David Walker stood at the gate of Lily's old house, the place where the strange events had begun to surface. The weak yellow glow from the street lamps reflected in the puddles, creating ghostly silhouettes that Ava couldn't shake from her mind. "How are you feeling?" David asked, his voice dry, his eyes still fixed on the house. "Lily's death is only the beginning. I don't think this is just an ordinary murder." Ava didn't answer right away. She stood in silence, a coldness creeping into every corner of her body. At that moment, she couldn't deny that something mysterious was pressing down on them. The feeling of being watched by something invisible, unreachable, yet unmistakably present, made her shiver. They stepped inside the house where Lily's room remained untouched, as if frozen in time. The furniture was scattered, but there were no signs of forced entry. Everything looked abandoned, yet carried a strange sense of life, as if something had never truly left. Old photographs of Lily lined the walls, and one, in particular, caught Ava's attention. Lily stood in the middle of the Pinewood Forest, her eyes vacant, as if she was seeing something others could not. "Look closely at this photo," Ava whispered. "Something's not right. She's not just standing there in the forest." David turned to study the image, his eyes sharp but uncertain. "She's just a young girl. Nothing out of the ordinary. But maybe we should take a closer look at the details." Suddenly, in the silence, a sound came from upstairs. Soft but distinct, footsteps, as if someone were moving. Ava and David froze, glancing at each other with suspicion. The upstairs door was tightly shut, yet they could feel the presence of someone, or something. Ava couldn't explain the strange sensation in the air. It felt like a force pulling them towards some hidden darkness. They climbed the creaky stairs, each step echoing in the stillness. When they reached Lily's room, Ava couldn't suppress the chill running down her spine. She gently pushed the door open, and for a brief moment, thought she saw a hazy figure, a slender girl standing near the window, her face obscured by the dim light outside. But when Eva rushed in, no one was there. David stood silently for a moment, surveying the room. We should go. There's nothing here but vague fear, but Eva didn't want to leave. She felt that if they stopped now, something worse would happen. We need to find more clues, she insisted. These strange things, they might be part of a curse. I feel like something is calling us. Just then, a loud noise from the first floor startled them. The wind howled through the old windows, making them rattle like an eerie warning. Eva turned and looked out the window. Darkness had swallowed the entire Pinewood Forest. The rain continued to fall, but something in the air filled her with a deep, paralyzing fear. She suddenly remembered Sarah Donnelly's words. Lily didn't just die from stab wounds. Her death might be part of a cycle, an ancient curse. Eva couldn't stop thinking about it. She felt as if someone or something was pulling her into a darkness she couldn't escape. And then, when they returned to the living room, something strange happened. The chairs began to move on their own, as if unseen figures were sitting down. Unusual sounds echoed from all around. Whispers, faint and indecipherable, but chilling enough to freeze the blood. We have to leave, David said, his voice hoarse. He had lost his earlier composure. Something's happening here, and I don't think we can handle it. But Eva couldn't agree. She stood still, staring into the darkness outside the window, as if something was waiting for her. A heavy sense of dread filled her, but it wasn't enough to stop her from continuing. And then, in that moment, Eva heard a voice from behind. Lily. The voice was faint, unclear, yet laced with menace. She turned, and there, before her, a hazy figure appeared. A girl, her eyes lifeless but filled with pain. Lily stood there, her lips moving, as if trying to say something she could not. Eva felt her heart stop. We can't leave, she whispered. Lily's image slowly faded, and the room fell silent again. But Eva knew the truth was surfacing. An ancient curse, a restless soul, and a dark secret buried in the Pinewood Forest. She had to keep going, no matter what. Because if she didn't, they would be trapped in this darkness forever. A week had passed since Eva and David left Lily's house with heavy hearts and unanswered questions. But even though they had left the Pinewood Forest behind, the darkness still clung to them, refusing to let go. Eva couldn't forget the hollow look in Lily's eyes when she appeared in the room, her lips moving but unable to utter a word. That icy feeling still haunted her, as if something far greater awaited them just ahead. One morning, Eva woke with the sense that something had changed. She saw darkness enveloping her room, despite the morning sunlight already shining outside. On the table, her phone began to ring. An unknown number. Eva felt a pang of dread, but deep down, she knew this was inevitable. She picked up. Eva, came the voice of Sarah Donnelly, heavy with urgency. You need to come see me. Something very strange has happened. Sarah didn't need to say more. Eva already sensed that something terrible had occurred. Without hesitation, she got dressed and drove to meet Sarah. When she arrived, she saw a very different Sarah than usual. Her face had lost its calmness. Her eyes were weary, as if haunted by something beyond comprehension. Eva, I found something important, Sarah said as Eva sat across from her. I went back through the old records on Pinewood Forest, and I discovered that Lily wasn't the only one. Many people have died there before. Each one had stab wounds identical to Lily's, and all of them were victims of an ancient ritual, forgotten but never truly erased. Eva listened, a quiet dread rising in her chest. What kind of ritual? And what does it have to do with Lily? Sarah nodded, her eyes drifting, as if seeing into the past. This ritual was carried out by an ancient cult. They believed that to keep the forest's spirit strong, they had to sacrifice innocence. The stab wounds through the heart, abdomen, and throat were signs of a soul-binding process. Death was their way of channeling spirits into an eternal cycle. A chill ran through Eva. What she was hearing wasn't just myth or legend. It was a brutal curse that had lasted for centuries. Lily was only a single thread in a terrifying web someone had woven long ago. But the question still lingered. Why was Lily the chosen one? So how do we stop this curse? Eva asked, her voice trembling with fear. Sarah remained silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. To end it, we need to find the source, the place where the ritual began. And I believe Pinewood Forest itself holds the key. But Eva, I have to warn you. Not everyone makes it out of that forest. Many have tried, none have returned. Eva stared at Sarah, her thoughts torn. She wanted to help Lily, but a part of her feared she might become the next victim. Still, she couldn't walk away. The memory of Lily, those desperate eyes, still haunted her. Eva made her choice. She would continue, even if it meant facing death. The two of them set off for Pinewood Forest once more. The landscape hadn't changed, but this time, Eva felt a dark presence weighing down the air. The dry pine trees, the wind hissing through brittle branches. It all sounded like whispers following them. Every step brought them closer to the truth and closer to danger. As they ventured deeper, Sarah stopped and pointed toward a clearing among the trees. We need to go there. That's where the ritual took place. Eva followed her gaze and felt a cold shiver run through her. The clearing looked like a natural circle, the trees forming a strange, unnatural shape, as if building an invisible wall. Standing at its edge, Eva felt a pull, an invisible force drawing her in. They stepped into the clearing, and immediately the air grew heavier. The shadows around them seemed to come alive, curling and circling. Eva felt it. A powerful force she couldn't explain. Then Sarah suddenly stopped. Eva, can you feel it? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Eva looked around. She felt it too, someone standing behind her. But when she turned, there was nothing. The air was thick, disconnected from reality. And then a strange sound echoed in the distance. Soft footsteps, as if someone was approaching. Eva turned quickly, heart pounding. In the darkness, she saw a faint figure, a girl standing still. Lily? She called, her voice shaking. But the figure didn't respond. It simply faded, swallowed by the darkness. Eva couldn't take it anymore. We have to leave, now. But Sarah was already on her knees, her hand touching the ground. We can't, don't you see? It's not that simple. We can't just walk away. Eva stood motionless, staring at her. An indescribable feeling was spreading through her chest. What lay beneath the layers of this darkness wasn't just the curse of Pinewood. It was something far older. A terrifying punishment birthed by a force that had existed for centuries. They remained there, trapped in a spiral of death and lost souls that could never be freed. And then, from the darkness, a voice echoed, haunting, final. You cannot escape me. The feeling Eva experienced at that moment was impossible to name. The voice that had just echoed from the shadows, haunting and otherworldly, was unlike anything she'd ever heard. Each word it spoke rang like a challenge, a curse carved into her mind, unbreakable and absolute. Her entire body went numb, frozen in place as though something invisible had wrapped around her limbs, holding her tightly in place. Sarah stood beside her, her eyes seemingly glazed over, reflecting some kind of hidden light from within the darkness, clouded, distant, and full of fear. Eva had never seen Sarah look this vulnerable. The woman who had always been so composed, sharp, and cold, now appeared stripped of all control, unable to face whatever was coming. "Did you hear that?" Eva whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, but said nothing. She only glanced around, as if desperately searching for some logical explanation to ground her. But the shadows gave her none. The strange footsteps continued from somewhere deeper in the forest, like someone or something was approaching them in complete silence. Eva turned to look back, but the figure of the girl she thought was Lily had vanished. There was nothing left but silence, a terrifying, suffocating silence. She didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid that even the slightest movement might trigger something they couldn't escape. "We need to leave," Eva said in a firm, low voice. She couldn't stand still any longer. That suffocating feeling of being watched hadn't faded. It had only intensified, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were staring at her from within the dark. But Sarah didn't move. She had fallen to her knees, her hand touching strange impressions in the earth. Eva felt the shift in the air. Sarah wasn't the same anymore. It was as if something had taken hold of her, and Eva couldn't tell if it was something supernatural or simply pure fear unraveling her mind. "Sarah, we have to go now," Eva called out, louder this time. Still, no response. A cold wind swept past, raising the hairs on the back of Eva's neck. The wind carried with it whispers, faint, indistinguishable, but painful. A deep, aching fear stirred in her chest, one she had never known until now. Suddenly, she heard rapid footsteps behind her, and when she turned, Lily was there again, but not like before. This time, the girl's expression was filled with fury, her eyes wide with warning, as if trying to scream without sound. "That's not her!" Eva cried out. "That's not Lily!" But her body remained paralyzed, completely unable to move. And just as Eva spoke those words, the figure of Lily vanished into thin air, leaving behind a heavy emptiness and a gnawing guilt deep in her chest. She turned back to look at Sarah, but now Sarah was staring straight at her, and the look in her eyes. It wasn't calm anymore. It wasn't human. Sarah looked at Eva like she didn't recognize her at all. Her eyes had gone completely black, as if blinded by something invisible and ancient. "You don't understand, Eva," Sarah whispered. "Lily's death wasn't an accident. It was a warning." Eva swallowed hard, unable to fully grasp the meaning of Sarah's words. "A warning for what? This curse? It doesn't end with Lily," Sarah replied, her voice distant and cold. "She was just one piece of something much larger. And now, we're part of it too." Eva looked around, The entire forest seemed to be changing. It was like the trees had begun to breathe. The air grew heavier, thicker, choking with every breath. Above them, the sky had vanished. There was no light, only an overwhelming endless blackness, pressing down on them from all sides. Suddenly, a sound rang out, louder than anything they had heard before. It came from beneath them, a deep, bone-shaking rumble, like the splitting of roots underground, or the roar of some massive creature awakening after centuries of slumber. But it wasn't natural. It was something else, something alive, something ancient, a presence Eva couldn't even begin to comprehend. She shook violently. "Sarah, we have to leave right now." But Sarah had already risen to her feet, slowly stepping forward, her gaze blank, her awareness completely lost. "We can't, Eva," she said softly. "You don't get it. This darkness, it's already begun to swallow us. We have to perform the ritual. We have to return what was taken." Panic rose in Eva's chest. She stared into Sarah's eyes and knew she was gone. "What ritual? What are you talking about?" Sarah turned to her, offering a bitter, broken smile. "We've already touched it, Eva. There's no way out." Time was running out. Eva looked toward the forest, but saw nothing but pitch black, no path, no escape. The fear was unbearable. She couldn't let herself fall into this madness. She couldn't let Sarah go deeper. "Sarah, wake up!" she screamed. No response. And then the faint light from Eva's phone flickered across the ground. There, in the dirt, marks, stab marks, arranged in a pattern she recognized immediately. These weren't random. They were ritualistic. A sign, a summoning, the same pattern found on Lily's body. Sarah was repeating it. Eva knew if she didn't stop this, neither of them would ever leave Pinewood Forest alive. Eva felt like she was trapped in an inescapable nightmare. Both she and Sarah had been pulled into an invisible current, a force they couldn't control, couldn't understand. But what terrified Eva more than anything else was the change in Sarah. The once strong, clear-headed, and rational woman had now been drawn into a deep, overwhelming darkness from which even she couldn't escape. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Eva trembled, trying to grasp Sarah's hand as she continued walking forward, her eyes empty, as if unaware of her surroundings. "We need to get out of here now." But Sarah didn't react. She kept moving, each step seemingly driven by some unseen force leading her onward. Eva couldn't just stand by. She knew that if she didn't act, both of them would fall into a spiral with no end. A suffocating pressure weighed down on Eva. She looked back at the forest, where the darkness was growing thicker by the minute. The rain still fell, and amidst the heavy atmosphere, an eerie silence blanketed everything. Eva could hear her own breathing, Sarah's footsteps, but everything felt sucked into another space, a place where time no longer existed. She looked around, desperately searching for any sign, any way out. Then a faint light flickered in the corner of her eye. It wasn't natural light. It came from below, deep within the heart of the forest. Eva didn't hesitate. She yanked Sarah's arm, determined not to let her fall into that abyss alone. "Sarah, come with me. Hurry." But just as she began to pull Sarah away, a scream rang out behind them. Not Sarah's scream, but one filled with excruciating pain, as if a soul was writhing in the dark, begging for help. Eva turned and saw another figure. Not Sarah, but something that resembled a part of her. A ghostly silhouette stood in the woods, illuminated by the light from her phone. Its shape strange, not quite human, but not entirely otherworldly either. "Lily!" Eva screamed, recognizing the figure immediately. It was the same image she had seen before, back when she and David first stepped into the forest. But this time, it wasn't silent. Lily's figure moved, her eyes locked onto Eva's with a look of pain and desperation. She's trying to say something, Eva thought, but she couldn't understand the message the spirit was sending. The light dimmed, and for a moment, Eva sensed a shift in the air. The rain had stopped, yet the atmosphere remained heavy. It felt like someone was standing right beside her, silently watching. Eva turned and saw that the darkness was deepening, as if the forest itself was swallowing everything whole. "What do we do?" Eva asked aloud, but no one answered. The two women stood frozen, unable to break free from the spiral they'd fallen into. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from a distance. The wind roared through the ancient pine trees. Leaves rustled beneath their feet. But it wasn't the wind. Eva realized it was laughter. A dry, strange laugh, as if someone hidden in the shadows was watching them. "This can't go on," Eva thought. "If it does, we'll be trapped here forever." She rushed forward, not daring to look back. As she ran, she could hear Sarah's footsteps behind her, but didn't dare turn to check. She didn't know if Sarah was still keeping up, or if the darkness had already swallowed her whole, but Eva knew she couldn't stop, couldn't hesitate. Every second she lingered, it felt like an invisible hand was trying to pull her back, but she couldn't let go. She had to keep moving. As she neared the place where the light had flickered earlier, she saw a large stone slab in the middle of the forest. Dried blood stained its surface, as if someone had once lain there, suffering. And at the center of the stone, a deep indentation marked its surface. A strange symbol. It resembled a sigil, but unlike any she'd seen before. As Eva stepped closer, a chill blew past, making the hair on her neck stand up. The light from her phone reflected off the mark. And suddenly, a faint sound rose from beneath her. Startled, Eva stepped back. The noise wasn't coming from far away. It was from right under her feet. The ground trembled. "Sarah!" Eva shouted. But there was no reply. Suddenly, a cold hand burst up from the earth, gripping Eva's ankle. She screamed, trying to wrench herself free from the icy grasp. But it was no use. The pain was overwhelming. She couldn't breathe. And this time, it wasn't just one hand. Other hands emerged from the soil, from the darkness. Invisible limbs clawing upward, trying to drag her down. Eva couldn't fight back anymore. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night. Her whole body was pulled toward the ground. And as she felt herself sinking into that pit, something reached out from the shadows, cold and merciless. Eva didn't know how long she was unconscious. When she awoke, all that remained was dead silence. The forest was nothing but darkness. But Sarah was gone. She had vanished, as if taken into another world. Eva stood up, completely drained. She had no idea what had happened, but she knew that if she didn't find a way out, she would be the next to become part of this cruel curse. Eva felt as though she were trapped in a never-ending nightmare. Her vision blurred from dizziness, and her body was drained to the brink of collapse. She lay on the ground, unsure how long she had been unconscious. Around her, only silence reigned. Heavy, oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. No birdsong, no rustling wind through the branches. Just a presence, unseen but undeniable, lingering in the air like a weight. She struggled to stand, her limbs trembling, aching, but she couldn't stop. Sarah was gone. She was no longer there, and Eva had no idea if she was still alive. Everything had descended into chaos, and though she was now alone, Eva knew she couldn't leave without discovering the truth. She had to confront whatever haunted this forest, whatever curse she had unwittingly stepped into. She looked around. The forest no longer looked the same. The trees loomed darker now, gnarled roots covered in thick moss. The air soaked with the stench of damp rot. It felt like the forest was alive, breathing, watching her. She heard footsteps behind her, soft like a passing breeze, but when she turned, no one was there. Her senses sharpened. Every movement she made was cautious, measured. Her own breathing made the air feel tighter, suffocating. Then suddenly, she heard whispers, like voices from far away, delicate yet laced with menace. Eva listened closely, trying to decipher where the sounds were coming from. She began to move faster, every step feeling like she was chasing something unseen, something vital. As she pushed deeper into the forest, the air thickened. A sudden cold breeze swept past her, making her shudder. But this wasn't just wind. It carried the coppery scent of old blood, of death. That was when Eva realized this forest wasn't just abandoned. It was a witness, a living graveyard, steeped in terrifying secrets. Her steps halted when she saw a large stone slab nestled between the trees, almost hidden beneath overgrowth. On the surface was a strange indentation. Eva approached, heart pounding. She recognized the mark. It was the same symbol Sarah had shown her in the old documents. A sign of the ancient ritual. A mark of sacrifice. She reached out and touched the stone's surface. The cold seeped into her hand, sending a shiver through her spine. And just as she started to pull away, a deep, ominous rumble echoed from beneath the ground. Eva stumbled back. The stone was no longer dormant. It began to tremble. A hidden force pulled her toward it. Her feet started to slide, dragged by something unseen. She fought to stay upright. Then suddenly, an icy hand burst from the soil, clamping onto her ankle. Eva screamed, trying to break free, but the grip was too strong. Pain surged through her as she was dragged down, struggling to breathe. The whispers returned louder now, but Eva no longer feared them. She knew she couldn't let this darkness consume her. When she looked down at the hands gripping her, she saw something strange. They weren't monstrous. They looked human, yet they were not. These were spirits, souls trapped in this cursed place long ago, unable to move on, eternally ensnared in the cycle of death. There was no time to think. Eva had to escape. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of strength, and yanked her leg free from the icy grip. She turned to see darkness swallowing everything, engulfing the stone, spreading like a force determined to erase all light. She couldn't let it win. She had to keep going. "Lily," she whispered, her voice weak but resolute. "I will save you." She began to run, though she didn't know where. Every path led deeper into shadow. But then, footsteps echoed behind her. She turned and saw a faint figure. It was Lily, or at least part of her. Eva couldn't tell if she was seeing a ghost or a memory. But that image ignited something inside her. She had to keep searching, no matter the terror ahead. Lily stood there, her eyes no longer filled with despair. Instead, they glowed with determination. as if urging Eva to understand. Eva stepped closer, but an invisible force yanked her back, sending her to the ground. From beneath the soil, the cold hands reached up again. But this time, Eva didn't flinch. She stood, locking eyes with Lily. And in that moment, something clicked. "She's calling to me," Eva murmured. "But what am I supposed to do?" Lily didn't answer. She just stood there, gazing toward the heart of the forest. And Eva understood. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a longer, harder journey. And if she didn't face it, she would be trapped here forever, cursed like the souls before her. She looked ahead, into the darkness, but this time, she wasn't afraid. She would go on, even if it meant sacrificing her life. Because she knew the only way out of this forest was to face the forgotten souls and set them free. Story 2. The Killer Jar. I can't remember the last time I spoke to Mark. It could have been at a birthday party during our freshman year of college, or perhaps at his mother's funeral a few years later. Old memories shatter like glass, each fragment falling and blending together with time and regret. Still, when I received a package from an unfamiliar address in Oregon, the place Mark had moved to after some incident he never fully explained, I felt an odd sensation creeping in. Inside the old brown paper-wrapped box was a small glass jar, only about 2 finger lengths tall. It was sealed with a cork, and inside was a dark, viscous liquid, almost like blood coagulated after hours. The smell, I can't quite describe it, but as soon as I opened it, a cold metallic stench mixed with the odor of rotting flesh made me shiver. I was about to throw it in the trash when I noticed a small piece of paper at the bottom of the box. With every wish granted, a price must be paid. Only use when absolutely necessary. Mark? There was no further explanation. No mention of why he sent me this gift. No inquiry about how I was doing, and no return address. Just a glass jar filled with a disturbing liquid and a vague warning. I placed the jar on my desk amid unpaid bills and scattered papers. That night I couldn't sleep. From the living room, I could hear the ticking of the clock, each tick like the beat of a funeral march echoing through the old walls. Dogs were barking outside. The wind whistled through the window crack, cold and damp, making the overhead light flicker as if someone was silently breathing near my ear. That was when I whispered, "I wish this month's bills would disappear." I didn't know why I said that. Maybe it was just a test, perhaps out of exhaustion, or because my mind no longer could distinguish reality from illusion. But the next morning, when I woke up and stepped out of my bedroom, I froze. The entire pile of bills on the desk was gone. No trace. It was as if they had never existed. I searched the apartment. I checked the trash can, the mailbox, the drawers, but they were truly gone. And in that moment, the jar sat silently on the desk, still, arrogantly, like a poisonous snake waiting for the right moment to strike. 3 days later, I got a call from an old high school friend, Ashley. Her voice was choked with emotion. "Jason, have you heard the news? Brian was murdered last night. It was a robbery. The guy didn't take anything. The police said he just stabbed Brian and left." I almost dropped the phone. Brian was the first person I thought of when I received the doubled electric bill last month. I had joked with him, "If I die, at least I won't have to pay for this stuff." And now, he was dead, exactly 3 days after my little wish. I started to feel afraid. but I couldn't take my eyes off the jar. Its harmless appearance only drove me crazy. It felt like it was mocking me, silently whispering, "Do you want more?" I put the jar in a drawer and locked it. But then, when night came, everything changed. Strange sounds echoed from the office, like someone tapping gently on the glass. Rhythmic, like the heartbeat of someone waiting. Tap, tap, tap. I opened the door. The room was empty, but the drawer was open, and the jar sat proudly on the desk. The dim light from the lamp casting reflections on the liquid inside, making it seem like it was shifting, moving. For the second time, I made a wish. This time, something bigger. I wish I would win the lottery, and I won. $20 million. An unimaginable amount. My name appeared on the morning news, and the lottery spokesperson smiled brightly as she handed me the symbolic check. But the price, this time, it was too high. Flight 317 from San Francisco to Denver crashed just 11 minutes after takeoff. No one survived. Among the victims was a woman I had helped when her car got stuck at the Pine Street corner last month. I remember the grateful smile she gave me. Now, I see that smile on the obituary page, alongside the images of hundreds of other victims. I vomited in the bathroom. The jar still sat silently in the living room, a cold witness to the crime I dared not admit. I tried to throw it away. I put it in a trash bag and took it out to a dump several miles away. But by the next morning, it was back on the kitchen table, clean, with no stains. I tried to smash it, but when the hammer struck, my hand went numb, and the jar remained intact, not a scratch on it. I tried to take it to the church, but every time I stepped through the door, the jar started to heat up in my bag, burning like fire. The smell of blood returned, so strong that the priest had to ask if I was injured. I understood. It wouldn't let me leave anymore. It had chosen me. That night, as I drifted in and out of a restless sleep, Mark appeared in a nightmare. His face was distorted, melting, his eyes empty. I shouldn't have given it to you, but it chose you. We're just the link. And when you accepted it, you signed your own death sentence. I woke up with my heart racing, but in the corner of the room, the jar was still there. And for the first time, I saw it crack, as if it was smiling. I don't remember exactly how I managed to get out of bed that morning. Maybe it was fear driving me, or perhaps a part of me had already accepted the truth. Something was watching me, an evil force not of this world. The jar was no longer an inanimate object. It was alive. It thought, and I felt like it was hungry. I stuffed it into my backpack, drove over 300 miles to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Idaho, a place I'd visited with Mark in the summer of 2012. It was a strange trip. Neither of us had told the other why we had driven all night, just to stand in the middle of a desolate, snake-infested plot of land. Mark had once said, "There are places where, just standing there, you'll feel everything around you is wrong." I had laughed at him then. Not anymore. I dug a deep hole under the cracked concrete floor, used a shovel to break through the rotting foundation, and dropped the jar in, covering it with sand and debris. I left the backpack behind, not wanting anything related to it near me anymore. I turned away without looking back, and I thought, that was the end. But evil doesn't let go so easily. Just 3 nights later, I began hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, too much stress, but the whispers kept repeating. Not loud, not clear, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time the lights went out. They came from every corner, from the vents, from behind the bathroom door, even from under the bed. One night while I was trying to sleep, I heard a woman's voice whispering right next to my ear. "You wished, you can't take it back." I sat up abruptly. The room was empty, the light was on, but my collar was drenched in sweat, and the bed sheets had tiny handprints covered in dirt. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? A grown man, just hitting the jackpot, complaining that a jar was killing people because of his wish. I saw a psychologist, but their words were meaningless compared to the whispers that still haunted me every night. I went to a church, but the priest just looked at me with pity. Sin can be forgiven, but the price of the choice, you must bear it yourself. A week later, I got a call from an unknown number. "My name is Marlene. New Mark, I need to see you. As soon as possible." Her voice was raspy, heavy, like stones rolling down her throat. Something in the way she spoke made it impossible to refuse. We arranged to meet at an old bakery near the abandoned pier on the west side of town. She was a woman in her 60s, dressed in black from head to toe, her graying hair tangled as though it had never seen a comb. As soon as she sat down, she whispered, "It's back, isn't it? The jar." I didn't answer, but my eyes were enough for her to know. Mark was a fool. I told him to destroy it, but he thought he could control it. Until his sister died, that was the first wish. I froze. "That jar doesn't just grant wishes," Marlene continued. "It feeds an ancient entity. The Native Americans called it Shakanut, the one who exchanges blood for power. It has existed for centuries, hidden through generations. Every person who holds the jar thinks they can sever the deadly cycle, but none of them succeed. We're fools who thought we could play with death." I shuddered. "You've held it? Held it, hunted it, and survived long enough to warn you. But I don't have time." "You do?" She pulled out a thin notebook from her pocket, its leather cover worn, and slid it towards me. "Inside, there's a way to seal it. Can't destroy it, but you can bind it. Only once. If you fail, it will choose another." I opened the book, my hands trembling. The pages were written in both English and strange, ancient symbols. One page was marked in red. "You must have the blood of the summoner, the tears of the lost, and the ashes of the unspirit soul." "You can find these things," Marlene whispered. "But remember, every minute you hesitate, it grows stronger." I looked up, ready to ask more, but she had vanished, as if she had never existed. That night, when I returned home, I found the door to my apartment wide open. Inside, everything was in disarray, but nothing was missing, except one thing: the jar. It was lying in the middle of the living room floor, still intact, no scratches, no dirt, despite my having buried it deep underground. And now, it was cracking. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, but it didn't shatter. The liquid inside bubbled lightly, like a creature breathing. I started crying because I understood. I was no longer the master of the wish. I was just a source of supply. It wanted me to keep going, to wish more, until I ran out of humanity, ran out of compassion, and died in loneliness like the many before me. I had a choice: use Marlene's book, try to seal it. But that also meant I would face the souls I had indirectly killed. And if I failed, I wouldn't die a normal death. I turned to the last page of the notebook, a scribbled line, as if written in haste. If you hear the call from the earth, don't answer, even if it's the voice of the one you love most. I couldn't sleep for 3 nights after meeting Marlene. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the jar would appear vividly, shattered, with cracks on its surface as if it were mocking me with a smile. I thought I was going to die, but a part of me urged me to keep going, to find a way to save myself and those around me. Marlene's notebook was no simple thing. It was a chaotic jumble of ancient characters, hurriedly written incantations, and yellowed, tattered pages worn by time. But one thing was clear. The ritual to seal the jar was no joke. It required sacrifice, blood, and even a soul. I couldn't stop, because I knew the jar wouldn't let go. It was looking for the next person, and I would be the last. Or maybe I would be the one to pave the way for it. One day, I happened to overhear an old story from one of Marlene's friends, a man named Gregory. He was one of the few who had witnessed the jar's power in the past. I knew I had to find him. I needed to understand the true nature of the jar and how to seal it before it was too late. But when I found Gregory, he was no longer the man he once was. He lived alone in a dilapidated house with no electricity or running water. The space was dark and silent, like a basement underground. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling that this place was part of the ritual, a location haunted by forces beyond human comprehension. Gregory didn't look at me when I entered. He sat there, his eyes sunken, his face grim, full of scars and signs of exhaustion that could never be healed. He just nodded, as if he already knew I would come. "You're the next one," Gregory whispered. "The jar doesn't spare anyone. It will take everything you love. But you want to know how to imprison it, don't you?" I nodded. "There's no way to completely destroy it," Gregory said, his voice raspy. "But if you want to imprison it, you need to find 3 items. The blood of the summoner, the tears of the lost, and the ashes of an unredeemed soul." I swallowed hard. "And how am I supposed to find these things?" Gregory closed his eyes, mouthing silently. "The blood of the summoner. It's not easy to obtain. You have to cut off a part of your own body. That's the price you pay. As for the tears of the lost, that's something you'll have to witness. It won't be easy. The lost one won't let you take their tears easily. And finally, the ashes of an unredeemed soul. That's the soul of someone you've harmed. A soul that hasn't found peace. You must bring it back and keep it in a separate jar." I felt nauseous hearing him say that, but I couldn't back down. The jar wasn't just threatening my life. It had taken innocent lives. And if I didn't stop it, it would continue. And I, no matter what price I had to pay, would stop it. I began my search. The blood of the summoner was the first thing I could obtain. I stood in front of the mirror, holding a sharp knife, looking into my own eyes. I cut my right hand. Blood poured out, hot and bright red, like the first sign of sacrifice. I poured a little into a small jar that Marlene had given me, making it part of the sealing ritual. But that was just the beginning. Next, I had to face something I never wanted to confront. The tears of the lost. That day, I went back to the place where I had met Ashley, the old friend I had never told about the jar. She was the only one I still kept in contact with, and I had a terrifying fear that among all the deaths I couldn't explain, she would be the next. When I arrived at her house, Ashley was sitting in the living room, dazed like a sleepwalker. Her eyes were red, and she was clutching an old photo of us, memories that had faded. I can't find him, she said, her voice choking. He's been missing since yesterday. I don't know what to do. A cold sensation, like the hand of a ghost, touched me. I knew something was wrong. She was under the jar's influence. It wasn't me, but the jar that was manipulating her. He'll come back, Ashley, I said, trying to remain calm. He won't leave you. But when I saw her eyes, I knew I had just witnessed the tears of the lost. She was falling into a spiral that I couldn't save her from. When I returned, I knew I had no more time. The jar had started reacting. The cracks on its surface were now spreading, as if it wanted to break free, escape from my control. The whispers started again, louder this time, and I felt as though an invisible hand was tightening around my heart. I needed the ashes of the unredeemed soul, but the price I had to pay for this release would be unimaginable. The people I had unintentionally harmed, the souls left in the dark. They would come back. They were waiting for me, and I didn't have much time left. That night I couldn't sleep. In fact, I couldn't even try. The images of the past, the mistakes I had made, the people I had unknowingly hurt, all of them surrounded me like an unending nightmare. The jar was waiting for me. It had started to awaken, and I knew that if I didn't act now, I would never be able to escape. With each passing hour, the jar seemed to grow stronger. The cracks on its surface spread wider, as if it was slowly eating away at itself, waiting for the moment to explode. The cold feeling in the room became more pronounced, and I couldn't shake the thought that once the jar completely shattered, there would be nothing left to stop it. I remembered what Gregory and Marlene had said. I needed to find the ashes of an unspirit soul. But whose soul? How could I possibly find those I had hurt throughout my life? The small mistakes or random decisions that could turn an innocent person into a victim in this deadly game. And now, I had to face them. I decided to return to where it all began, Mark's house. I couldn't tell anyone the reason for going there, because I knew if I did, no one would believe me. The house was now abandoned, its windows shattered, and thick layers of dust covered everything that had long been untouched. But as I stepped inside, there was a strange feeling, as if I was entering a space that didn't belong to this world, where the past and present blended together, dissolving into the darkness. The jar, it seemed, had been waiting for me here. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a cold gust of wind blew through, making me shiver. I looked around, but saw nothing but the remnants of the past. But when I turned back, the jar appeared right in front of me, placed on the old wooden table where we used to sit and drink beer on summer nights. I didn't know why, but in that moment, I understood that I couldn't escape the souls I had inadvertently pushed into darkness. Every death I had caused, every time I had used the jar, left a mark that couldn't be erased. And now, those souls were coming back. First, it was Brian. I never thought his death could be connected to me. But as I looked at his old photograph on the table, I realized the brutal truth. He had died because of me. Without the jar, he would still be alive, maybe even married, maybe doing the things he had dreamed of. But I made a wish, and the price was his life. The whispering started again, this time clearer, closer. Jason, why didn't you come to me sooner? I turned around and Brian's image stood before me, faint in the darkness. His face was no longer the person I remembered. It seemed distorted, blurred through the layers of dust and shadows, but I still recognized the eyes. The eyes of an old friend, filled with rage and pain. I didn't want to die, but you wished, Jason. You brought us into this cycle. Brian, I didn't know. I didn't know it could turn out like this. I had no choice. I stepped back, my hands trembling, unsure of what to do. But then, as if he had heard my words, Brian silently faded into the shadows, and I felt a shift in the air. Another cold breeze swept through, but this time, it wasn't from the window. It came from behind me, where I couldn't see. Run, Jason. The voice wasn't Brian's. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It was the voice of another spirit. A spirit I had never seen. But I knew it was getting closer. I turned around and saw Mark, but not the Mark I once knew. He stood there, his face pale, his eyes lifeless. I told you, no one can escape it. The jar will never let go. The jar began to shake, the cracks becoming more pronounced, as if it was about to shatter. I no longer had time. I had to complete the ritual, but I couldn't do it alone. I began to remember what Gregory had said. The blood of the summoner, the tears of the lost, and the ashes of the unspirit soul. But how can I? I stammered. I can't hurt them anymore. There was only one way. A way I couldn't imagine. But I had no choice. I had to sacrifice a part of myself. I had to take the ashes from my own soul, and it would become part of the seal. I couldn't say goodbye. I couldn't look back. I moved toward the jar, looking at the cracks that were spreading wider, and wondered if I had the courage to end this nightmare. As I performed the ritual, I didn't feel pain, but the coldness flooded through me, as if my soul was slowly being pulled out. I knew once it was finished, I wouldn't be the same. When the jar finally shattered, a violent wind swept through, and I felt something horrifying being released. But when it was still, I knew I had completed the task. The jar was gone, but the souls of those I had harmed remained. I couldn't run away. The price to be paid would always haunt me. Story 3. No one's there, but the chair is never vacant. I never believed in strange things. Not until I moved into Franklin Heights last October. Franklin Heights is about a 20-minute drive from downtown Philadelphia. The building was built in the 1960s. Gray concrete walls, long dim hallways lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs, and a musty smell that never really goes away. But the rent was cheap, and after a painful breakup with my ex-husband, I needed a place to start over, somewhere quiet, where no one knew who I was. My apartment 3C was at the very end of the third-floor corridor, near the emergency stairwell. Right outside my door sat an old plastic chair, once red, now faded into a burnt orange, its legs slightly bent like they could snap at any moment. When I first moved in, I thought someone had forgotten to throw it out, but the neighbors said the chair had always been there. "Don't touch it," Mr. David from 3B warned with a strange smile. "It's part of the building's tradition." I chuckled awkwardly. A tradition? A busted old chair in the hallway? It sounded ridiculous. But then the strange things began. During the second week, that night, I got home late from a night shift at the hospital. Exhausted. All I wanted was a hot bath and sleep. As I climbed the stairs to the third floor, I noticed something odd. The chair had turned. Instead of facing the wall like it always did, It now pointed down the hallway, as if someone had just stood up and left. But I hadn't heard any footsteps. No doors opening, just the flickering of the hallway lights, more erratic than usual. My heart raced, but I brushed it off. Probably just a draft from the stairwell, I told myself. I pushed open my door. The hinges groaned. I flipped the switch. The lights blinked 3 times, then died completely. My apartment plunged into darkness. Cursing under my breath, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. Just as I aimed the beam toward the breaker, I heard it. The sound of a chair scraping against concrete. A harsh, screeching drag, like plastic legs scraping against the hallway floor. It went on for several seconds, then silence. I slammed the door shut, heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to check the security footage. Thankfully, there was a camera at the end of the 3rd floor hall, pointed directly toward my door. I asked Gary, the building's maintenance guy, if I could see the footage. He shrugged. You're not the first to say something weird happened with that chair, but the camera never catches anything. I didn't believe him. He rewound the footage to around 2:00 a.m., right when I had heard the sound. The hallway was empty. The chair didn't move. No one appeared. No shadows. No sounds. Is the camera working? I asked, trying to hide my confusion. Gary nodded. Fully functional, but anytime something weird happens with that chair, the camera just doesn't pick it up. 3 nights later, I started dreaming about the chair. In the dream, I stood in the pitch-dark hallway. The chair faced away from me, but I felt someone was sitting there. A blurred silhouette. No face, no features, just presence. When I stepped closer, the chair began to turn. Slowly, groaning like rusted metal. And then I saw myself. A different version of me, sitting in the chair. Vacant eyes, shaking hands, like she had seen something unspeakable. I woke up soaked in sweat. The next morning, I saw Maya, the student who lived in 3D. She was the only one in the building who still talked to me. When I first moved in last year, she whispered, I used to hear laughing at night. Very soft, a woman's laugh. But when I opened the door, no one was there. I shivered. She added, back in June, there was a guy named Anthony in 3F. One night, he said someone knocked on his door, calling his name. He went out into the hall, sat in the chair, and never came back. Police found his body in the bathtub. But the weird thing is, the CCTV never recorded him leaving the chair. It was like he never left the hallway. He never left. That night, I set my phone to record through the narrow crack of my front door. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the screen distorted, static, flickering, and then a shadow appeared. The silhouette of a woman. No visible body. Just a long, stretched shadow sliding beneath my door, reaching all the way to the foot of my bed. And then, I got a text from an unknown number. Stop recording. You're seeing things you shouldn't. I gasped. My heart pounded. I looked at the message again. But the number had disappeared. No contact. No history. Gone. Like it had never existed. On the 10th night, I woke up to see the hallway lights burning brighter than ever. I cracked the door open. The chair had moved. It now sat directly in front of my door. Right there, waiting. I panicked and ran for the stairs. But my phone rang. It was Mr. David from 3B. Don't open it, he said, voice trembling. This isn't the first time. The last person who did was my wife. She never came back. I turned around. The hallway light began to flicker. Creak, creak, creak. The chair was turning again. No one sat in it, but it moved. I bolted the door, pulled the curtains, turned off every light, and for the first time in years, I prayed. Because I knew something was waiting for me right outside my door. And it wasn't human. I didn't leave the apartment for 3 days after that night. The chair remained outside the door, untouched. None of the neighbors said a word. No one dared to admit they were seeing anything too. I felt like I was living in a sealed-off space, where time moved slowly and heavily, and every sound echoed with a strange tone, as if coming from somewhere beyond this world. I tried to hold on to reality. Did the dishes, mopped the floor, watched TV on mute, but no matter what I did, the sound of that chair scraping across the floor, screech, screech, kept echoing in my mind. And the image of the shadowy woman in the video clung to my thoughts like smoke. I didn't dare open the door, didn't dare step into the hallway. But on the third night, I received a letter. No one knocked, no footsteps. But when I opened my eyes after a short nap, a yellow envelope was lying under the door. No sender, no return address. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper and a line of trembling handwriting that read, "If you see the chair outside your door, it's time you learned about Amelia." I asked Maya, and her face went pale at the mention of the name. "Amelia used to live in 3C. That's your apartment now," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was a single mother with a little boy named Liam. I'm not sure what happened, but I heard she vanished without a trace in 2014. The police never found a body. The boy was sent to foster care. I swallowed hard. "And the chair?" I asked. Maya glanced toward the hallway and quickly shut her door. It was hers. She used to sit out there every night, watching her son play in the hall. I even heard her singing lullabies at night once. But after she disappeared, the chair stayed, like part of her. I decided to search for Amelia's missing person case at the city library. In an old 2014 article, I found her portrait, pale face, dark circles under her eyes, yet hauntingly beautiful in a sad way. There was something familiar in her gaze, as if I'd seen it before, in the mirror after sleepless nights. The article stated that Amelia Rourke, 34, was reported missing after neighbors heard a scream around 2:15 a.m. When police arrived, the apartment door was unlocked, no signs of struggle, but all the lights in the third-floor hallway were out. The red plastic chair remained in its usual spot, facing the wall. Her son Liam, 6 years old at the time, was found curled up under the bed, clutching a teddy bear. He didn't speak a single word for 3 months after that. I returned to my apartment with a cold ache clinging to my spine. That night, I dreamed of Liam. He stood in the hallway, head bowed, holding his teddy bear. When I walked toward him, he whispered, "Mom didn't leave. She's still here. Can't you see her?" I turned, and the chair slowly rotated to face me. Sitting on it was Amelia. She looked at me, her smile twisted, pulled unnaturally to one side. "You live in my apartment," she said. "You heard me. You saw me." I screamed and woke up with a deep red handprint bruised into my left arm. I began hearing sounds each night, soft lullabies, the screech of a chair dragging, childlike footsteps running down the hall. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then Maya sent me a recording. "I recorded this the night before last. I think you should hear it." I put on headphones, and instantly the familiar sounds washed over me. A lullaby in a strange language, a blend of English and syllables I had never heard. And at the end of the recording, a young boy's whisper, "Don't let her sit down." I went to see Mr. David again. He looked at me with tired, knowing eyes. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked, his hand trembling as he poured tea. "You've heard the lullaby, dreamed of her." I nodded. Mr. David told me that in 2015, a man living in my current apartment went mad after hearing the lullaby for 3 weeks straight. He destroyed all his belongings and eventually set himself on fire in the bathtub. "Do you know what everyone who lived there had in common?" he asked. I stayed silent. They all saw the chair move, and they all received a letter about Amelia. That night I didn't sleep. I set my phone on the floor, recording video throughout the night. 2:13 a.m. The wooden door to my room began to tremble softly. No wind, no knocking. I crept over and looked through the peephole. No one. But when I looked down, I saw the reflection of feet on the hallway floor. I opened the door. The chair was gone. Shivering, I turned back, and there it was, sitting in the middle of my living room, frozen in place. No one had opened the door. No one had entered, but the chair was now inside my home. I dragged it back out, placed it in the hallway, and locked the door tightly. The next morning, I received a package. No clear sender. Inside was an old photograph. Amelia and Liam sitting on that same chair. She held her son close, her eyes sad but warm. On the back of the photo in faded ink, it read, "If you find the chair inside your home, it's already too late." I looked out into the hallway. The chair was gone, and from the bedroom I heard a soft lullaby, exactly like the one in Maya's recording. I thought I would get used to the strange things. After countless nights of hearing the sound of dragging chairs, lullabies echoing through an empty hallway, and receiving letters from unknown senders, I believed that fear had finally dulled within me. But it hadn't. True terror began the moment I saw the person from the photograph. In real life, the night I received the photograph, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the sofa, clutching the small picture, studying every detail of Amelia's face. Her softly curled shoulder-length hair, the gentle sadness in her smile, her hand resting lightly on young Liam's shoulder. The air in the room felt frozen. I could feel her gaze watching me, not from the photograph, but from somewhere closer. Closer, maybe, from the chair. Even though I had moved it back out into the hallway, even though I had locked the door tightly, deep down, I knew it would come back. And it did. 2:36 a.m. I heard a soft creaking sound coming from the living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Then footsteps. Not rushed, not heavy, tiptoeing, deliberate, as if someone was carefully testing each step on the wooden floor. I heard the chair drag, screech, a screech, and then a sigh. Not mine. I didn't dare turn my head, didn't dare leave the bed. And then a voice whispered softly in my ear, "Why are you sitting in my place?" I jolted upright. The room was empty, the door still locked, but the chair was back, right in the middle of the room. The next morning, I knocked on Mr. David's door. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Something felt wrong. I called building security. When they forced the door open, the apartment was pitch black, curtains tightly drawn, dirty dishes piled in the sink, but Mr. David was gone. We found a piece of paper neatly placed on the table. The ink had smudged, but the words were still legible. It's no longer a chair. It's a door. A door? A door to what? I held the note in trembling hands. The words were simple, but they carried a despair that was hard to name. From that day forward, Mr. David was never seen again. No one could reach him. There was no record of him leaving the building, as if he had never existed. I began digging deeper. I contacted a woman named Eleanor Stokes, a former journalist who had once followed Amelia's disappearance back in 2014. Thankfully, she still lived in a quiet suburb near Norristown. I met her on a cold November afternoon. Her small wooden cottage stood hidden among tall pine trees. So quiet, I could hear the wind squeezing through the doorframe. Eleanor was old now, white-haired, sharp-eyed, and quietly sad. "You live in apartment 3C?" she asked, frowning. "You shouldn't be there." I told her everything. The chair, the dreams, the photo. "Mr. David." She nodded slowly. "Amelia didn't disappear the way people think," she said. "She once came to me for help. Just days before she vanished, she called me, said something was opening in her apartment. She believed that chair was a link between this world and another, a colder one, a darker one." I shivered. Later, Eleanor continued. "She called me again, panicked, said Liam had wandered into the other side. She heard him calling from the hallway, but when she opened the door, no one was there. Only the chair, spinning. Before I left, Eleanor handed me an old notebook. You need to understand. Everyone who has ever communicated with the chair sees something different. Some hear voices, others dream. But for Amelia, it became a gate to her son. I read the notebook through the night. On the final page, written in red ink, scrawled and uneven, was one haunting sentence. "If you see it in the mirror, it's already too late." I decided to test it. The next evening, I placed a large mirror facing the chair. The room was oppressively silent. I turned off all the lights, leaving only the faint glow from the street lamp outside. At first, nothing. Then, I saw it in the mirror, a blurry figure, sitting in the chair. I turned around, no one. But in the mirror, the figure remained perfectly still, head slightly tilted, hands resting on the lap, like it was waiting for something. I stepped closer, my hands shaking. The figure began to lift its head. It was Amelia, but her eyes were gone. Just two deep, endless sockets. I screamed and smashed the mirror. The following week was hell. The power kept cutting out. I heard lullabies every night. My front door would open on its own at exactly 2:13 a.m. I tried to leave Franklin Heights, but my phone wouldn't call out. The internet disappeared. Police didn't believe a word I said. I was trapped, and I wasn't the only one who knew it. On the 7th morning, Maya knocked on my door. Her face was pale. "I saw Liam," she whispered, "at the stairwell on the 3rd floor. He pointed me to the laundry room and then vanished." We decided to go together. The laundry room was small, tucked behind the fire escape. No one ever used it. The rusted door groaned as it opened. Inside was a chair, not the red plastic one, but an old wooden chair, painted red, caked in dust, and hanging on the wall was a photograph of me sitting in that chair, smiling, with Amelia. Story 4. The Child That Haunts the Restricted Area. I started my shift at 10 p.m. Warehouse 17 sits on the edge of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a long abandoned area recently rented out for industrial storage. During the day, the place looks like nothing more than a dusty, cobweb-covered facility, stacked high with crates and forgotten equipment. But once night falls, the atmosphere changes, as if the very walls are whispering to one another. I was the only night guard assigned to the site. They said the job was easy. Monitor the security cameras, patrol twice a night, and report any unusual activity. But there was something they didn't tell me. That the cameras often captured something that shouldn't exist. I saw it for the first time in my second week. 2 a.m. I was sitting in the surveillance room, eyes sore from hours of staring at the monitors. A small movement in the corner of screen 4 made me jump. I zoomed in and my heart nearly stopped. A little girl, wearing a white dress, hair long enough to hide most of her face, running around Zone 3, a section that had been sealed off for safety reasons. No one was allowed in there. I switched on the floodlights, tracking her movement with the camera. But within seconds she vanished, as if she'd never been there at all. I rushed to Zone 3, flashlight and radio in hand, but the area was completely empty. No footprints, no sound. Just an icy cold seeping through my uniform. I told my supervisor, Mr. Mitchell, an older man, kind but quiet. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Sometimes cameras glitch." But in his eyes I saw something else. Avoidance. Every night after that, the girl appeared again. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. Always in Zone 3. Always in the same white dress. One night, I brought my personal camera to film it myself. When I played the footage back, I saw not just the girl running, but something worse. A tall, shapeless shadow standing behind her, watching, guarding. That's when I knew this was no ordinary security job. I started digging into the warehouse's history through a local woman named Darlene, who ran the coffee shop on the corner. I learned something not recorded in any official report. 13 years ago, a massive fire had broken out in Zone 3. A group of children had snuck inside to play hide and seek. When the fire erupted, firefighters recovered 3 bodies. One girl was never found. Her name was Amelia Carter. That night I returned to the warehouse with a heavy weight on my chest. While patrolling Zone 3, I heard soft footsteps behind me, like a child dragging slippers across the concrete. I turned, but there was nothing there. Then, a soft laugh echoed, cold, hollow, not from in front of me, not behind me, but rising up from the floor. Suddenly, my flashlight died. In the darkness, I saw her, the girl, standing in the aisle, no more than 10 meters away. Black, empty eyes, dried blood crusting the edge of her dress. I froze. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Only one thought repeated in my head. "Why did you come back?" I called the police. They came and swept the entire building. Found nothing. But one officer, named Collins, pulled me aside. "You saw her too, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't reply. I just nodded. He sighed. Back in 2012, I was the first responder to that fire. When we reached Zone 3, I swear to God, something grabbed my wrist and held me back. I don't believe in ghosts, but I know that place. It isn't clean. After that night, things got worse. She didn't just show up on the cameras anymore. I started seeing her in other parts of the warehouse. The restrooms, the hallways, even the surveillance room. Every time she appeared, the lights would flicker, the temperature would plummet, and the air filled with the scent of burnt smoke. I was haunted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, standing in the flames, mouth moving, saying something I couldn't hear. I told my old friend Marcus, now a pastor. He wasn't surprised. He only asked one thing. Has she ever touched you? No, I said. He just nodded, but his face grew tense, more serious than I'd ever seen. A week later, I received a strange video through the security system. No sender, not saved in any backup. But when I opened it, it showed me, nodding off in the surveillance room. And behind me, Amelia, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, smiling. The clip ended with a blood-curdling scream. My scream. But I had no memory of making it. That's when I understood. Amelia isn't just a wandering spirit. She's waiting for something, or more terrifyingly, someone. I handed in my resignation the following morning. With whatever rationality I had left, I told myself it was the right thing to do. The longer I stayed, the more I felt myself being pulled into something unexplainable. A vortex between past and present, between the living and the dead. But as I walked through the warehouse gate for the last time, my phone buzzed. A strange message, no number, just a single line. You're not allowed to leave yet. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. But what chilled me to the bone was that my phone's wallpaper had been changed to a photo taken from behind my neck while I was dozing off in the surveillance room. And behind me was her, the girl, Amelia. I had no memory of ever taking that picture. No one could have accessed my account. And I knew I had no choice but to go back. I met with Pastor Marcus again. This time, he brought with him an old leather notebook crammed with records of strange events that had occurred in Cedar Falls over the years. One section described restless spirits, trapped where they died, not because they wanted to stay, but because something held them there. If Amelia died in the fire, and no one ever found her body, Marcus said, her soul might not have been able to accept it. But the more terrifying thought is, what if something led her to that death? And whatever it was, is still here. I looked at Marcus, a nameless dread rising in my chest. You mean, it wasn't just Amelia? He only nodded. Then he told me there had been 3 disappearances around the warehouse area, all quietly ignored because the victims were homeless. People no one noticed when they vanished. All of them occurred after the fire. That night I returned to the warehouse, not for work, but to end this. I brought with me a voice recorder, a UV flashlight, a bouquet of white flowers, and a scrap of a child's shirt that Darlene, the cafe owner, had found in a rotting wooden crate in her basement. She told me, I think it belonged to Amelia. Her mother used to work for me, took her own life a few months after the fire. Severe depression. I stood before unit number 3 now, just a block of scorched concrete and rusted steel. Cold wind whistled through the cracks. I laid the flowers on the ground and turned on the recorder. The room fell into silence. Until the sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned. No one, but the UV light in my hand flashed. And there, on the dusty cement floor, appeared small footprints glowing under the pale violet beam, leading away from where I stood, deeper inside. I followed them, thinking of nothing. Only fear and curiosity mixing like poison in my veins. The prints led to a scorched wall, a horizontal crack across it, as if it had once been broken through and patched up again. I knocked. Hollow? I grabbed a crowbar and struck the plaster. Behind it was a small iron hatch. The lock was rusted but still intact. I didn't understand how I had the key, until I realized it was the same blood-stained key I'd found last week in an old drawer, the one I thought was junk. The hatch creaked open, releasing a blast of icy air as if it hadn't been touched in 100 years. Below was a small concrete chamber, about 4 square meters, moldy walls, low ceiling. The dim beam of my flashlight twisted everything into something grotesque. In the center of the room stood an old baby stroller, and inside, a headless doll. I froze as I leaned down. The recorder in my pocket screeched, not static, but a child's voice. "Mommy, I'm cold. I don't want to play anymore." I stumbled back and fell hard to the floor. And in that instant, I saw a pair of eyes peering at me through a crack in the wall. Black, still. I shone the light. Nothing. But when I turned back toward the stroller, the doll was gone. Panic surged. I bolted out of the hatch. And just as I reached the entrance, I saw Marcus standing near Unit 1. His face was pale. "I just got a signal from the camera in Unit 3. Were you there?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. "I think there's something under the warehouse," I whispered. He didn't say anything, just showed me a freshly captured image from the night vision camera. In the photo, I stood beside the stroller, but behind me, a small pale hand reached out, touching my left shoulder, and in the far corner, a large shadowy figure loomed. No face. Holding a lighter, Marcus urged me to leave Cedar Falls for a while, but I knew this wasn't over. I still had the voice recorder, and when I played it later that night, alone in the cold living room of my rental apartment, I heard something that hadn't been there before. A man's voice, deep, raspy. "I told you not to come back." And then, childish laughter, long distorted, as if echoing up from the depths of the earth. I left Cedar Falls the very next morning. Not out of fear, but because of a strange compulsion, an ache deep in my chest. Something had not yet been spoken, not yet unearthed. Part of the story remained buried in the ashes, untouched, too frightening for anyone to dig up. And I, a night shift security guard who once thought this job only required a flashlight and a cup of coffee, had somehow become the last witness to a tragedy the entire town tried to forget. I traveled to Des Moines to meet the one person still alive who knew the truth about Amelia's family. Mrs. Mary Carter, her aunt, now living in a nursing home on the southern outskirts of town. Mary was nearly 90. Her eyes were clouded, but within them shimmered the faint light of distant memories. When I mentioned Amelia's name, her hands began to tremble, tilting the teacup and spilling hot water onto the tray. "You saw her, didn't you?" I nodded and slowly recounted everything. The child in the security footage, the basement under Warehouse 17, the stroller, the audio recording, the shadowy man. Mary sat in silence for a long time. Then she exhaled a deep sigh. I knew this day would come. There are things people think were buried long ago, but the ashes never truly smother the fire. Amelia, she didn't die because of the fire. She died because of the truth. She told me that her sister, Amelia's mother, used to work the night shift as a janitor at Warehouse 17. On the night of the incident, Amelia hadn't been playing hide and seek with friends. Her mother had brought her along because she couldn't leave her daughter home alone. But around 2 a.m., a gas leak sparked a fire. Amelia's mother passed out from inhaling the fumes. The only other person present, and the first to call the fire department, was the night supervisor, Walter Griggs. Walter had once been investigated for child abuse, Mary said, but no charges ever stuck. That man had a sickness, and I believe Amelia saw something she wasn't supposed to. She pulled out an old photograph. In it, Amelia, about 7 years old, stood next to a man in a brown leather jacket, his eyes as cold as steel. I recognized him instantly. He was the tall figure in the video, the man holding the lighter. I left the nursing home reeling. Everything was starting to connect. Amelia wasn't just a ghost trapped in place. She was the victim of a crime, one deliberately buried and forgotten. And that basement might have been where she was kept before the flames came. I returned to Cedar Falls with a metal detector and an infrared camera. This time, Marcus didn't come with me. He had left town after seeing the images from the camera that night. He couldn't handle it, but I couldn't stop. When I reopened the basement door, everything had changed. No more stroller, no more moldy walls. Just a room, strangely pristine. But in the far corner, beneath a thin layer of dust, lay a small silver ring, engraved inside with the initials AC. I picked it up, and instantly a cold jolt shot down my spine. I stood abruptly and realized the door had closed behind me. I tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. I pried, kicked, yelled, nothing. The darkness began to close in. Then, from above, ash began to fall, soft as snow. I panicked, still holding the ring. I shut my eyes and whispered, "Amelia, if you can hear me, show me what happened. I want to help you." No response, just a soft exhale behind me. I turned. She stood there. No blood, no twisted face. Just a 7-year-old girl staring at me with eyes so sorrowful it pierced straight through bone. She raised one hand and pointed at the wall behind me. I shone my flashlight and saw a word scratched into the plaster with fingernails. "He tied me here." I couldn't scream. He lit the fire. I was scared. I didn't want to die. I collapsed. In all my life, I had never felt such despair. Then, the door burst open. I stumbled out, carrying the ring and photograph. I knew I had to do the one last thing. I went straight to the police station and met with Officer Collins, the only one who had believed me from the beginning. I laid everything out: the footage, the audio, the photographs, Mary's testimony. Collins looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood, opened a drawer, and pulled out a weathered envelope. "We suspected Walter," he said, "but had no proof. Then he died in a car crash a few years ago. But the strange part is..." He opened the envelope and handed me the autopsy report. His entire body showed signs of severe thermal burns, but the accident was just a minor collision. No one could explain why his internal organs were burned like that. I sat in stunned silence. "You think it was Amelia?" Collins asked. I didn't answer, but deep inside, I knew justice had been served, not by the living. That night, I returned to Warehouse 17 one final time. I placed the silver ring at the center of Area 3 along with a white bouquet and a headless doll I had found in the car. Then I lit a small candle, The wind howled, but the flame never went out. I closed my eyes. This time, there were no whispers, no footsteps, only silence. Perfect silence. And when I opened them, she stood at the end of the hallway. One last time, she smiled. A real smile. No longer cold, no longer full of hatred. Then she turned and walked away, toward the far end of the corridor, where the dim light slowly swallowed her small silhouette. I left Cedar Falls carrying a story no one would believe, except for those who had heard weeping in the night, seen footprints in the ash, felt a cold that had nothing to do with weather, but with a soul long forgotten. Amelia Carter is finally at peace, but I'm not sure that everything in Warehouse 17 has ended, because one night, in a different town, hundreds of miles away, while working security at a newly opened shopping plaza, I saw a child in a white dress pass by the camera. And I swear, she smiled at me. I had left Cedar Falls, or rather, I tried to. The next city I moved to, a small town called Westbridge, was supposed to be a fresh start. I'd just accepted a night security job at a newly built shopping center. It felt like the right place to forget everything. But on the third night of work, at around 2:17 a.m., the northeast corner camera picked up movement. I turned to the monitor and saw a child in a white dress, long tangled hair falling over her face, walking slowly down the empty corridor, not running, not hiding, just searching. My chest tightened. I rushed out of the control room, flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the corridor, there was no one there, but the air smelled strange, damp ash and smoke. And on the clean white tiles was a single child's footprint, black with wet soot. I took a picture. When I examined the photo closely, I saw something that turned my blood cold. In the top left corner, reflected faintly in the glass door, was my face. But standing behind me was a dark silhouette wearing a cowboy hat, motionless. The next morning, I was approached by a woman named Evelyn Marlowe. She introduced herself as a paranormal researcher specializing in trapped child spirits. She had come here for a specific reason. Amelia Carter. I wrote an anonymous post on a spiritual investigation forum. She said, someone, probably you, shared that footage from Cedar Falls. The moment I saw it, I knew. That girl's not at peace. I didn't deny it, just nodded. Evelyn pulled a drawing from an old leather case. It depicted an underground iron door with scrawled letters written in black charcoal. Don't close it again. You opened the door, she said, locking eyes with me. But what you don't know is that it was never opened from the inside. Evelyn took me to meet someone, Derek Finch, who now lived about 30 miles outside of Westbridge in a rundown motel, barely ever leaving his room. He was the only survivor from the fire all those years ago who was still lucid enough to speak. At first, Derek refused to talk. But when Evelyn showed him the photo of the soot footprint I took the night before, he seemed hypnotized. He muttered, "She's back. But that's not her anymore." We asked him what he meant. Derek recounted that on the night of the fire, he and 2 other kids were hiding in the basement during a game of hide and seek. But when they realized Amelia was missing, they searched for her and saw her speaking to a man in a brown coat, wearing a cowboy hat, standing near the cellar door. He wasn't human. He never blinked, didn't breathe, and he smelled like fire that had been burning for years. Derek's voice dropped to a whisper. Amelia didn't follow him. He pulled her in. What Derek said shook me. Could it be that the one who trapped Amelia wasn't Walter Griggs, as I'd believed, but something posing as him? A being that lived in flame, devouring the souls of children. Evelyn called it the Ember Man, a piece of American folklore, spoken of only in hushed whispers across the Midwest. He appears as someone the victim once feared or trusted. If Walter was the last person Amelia saw before she died, her soul could have been fragmented. And the Ember Man took advantage of that to bind her. I shivered. If that was true, then Amelia wasn't just a victim. She was still being held by a malevolent entity worse than death itself. The truth was unraveling. But with it, the darkness grew nearer. That evening, Sheriff Lisa Grant called me. Someone had left a business card for me at the station, with printed stills from the night camera footage and a handwritten note. "He's found you." Lisa was a rational woman, but in her voice, I heard something I'd never heard from her before. "Fear, we need to talk, but not at the station. Come to my house. This has to do with my son." And that girl. Evelyn and I arrived at Lisa's home at 10 p.m. She opened the door with a pale face and ushered us inside. Laid across her living room table were dozens of childlike sketches, drawn in black and red crayon, all by her 6-year-old son, Ethan. Every single drawing showed the same image: an iron door buried in ash, and 2 small hands pressed against it from the inside, trying to force it open. "Ethan says the girl is trapped, but not in Cedar Falls, somewhere else, inside the mirror." We turned toward the large mirror in the living room. Lisa told us that whenever Ethan drew, he would stare into it, as if he saw another world inside. On instinct, I pointed an infrared flashlight at the glass and saw small handprints etched into the mirror's surface. Amelia wasn't bound to Cedar Falls anymore. Her soul had been shattered. One part remained trapped in the warehouse. The other, corrupted by the Ember Man, was roaming, seeking escape, through half-open doors, through security monitors, through mirrors. And the worst part, Ethan, a child, sensitive to such things, was becoming the next target. I left Lisa's house just before midnight. When I checked the mall security system on my phone, I saw a new message from an unknown number. I opened the door. "Now it's your turn to come through." Attached was a short video clip. It showed me standing in front of a mirror. But in the reflection, I wasn't there. Story 5. The Toilet That No One Dared to Use. My name is Mark. That year, I had just moved into an old boarding house on the north side of Portland, Oregon. The place used to be an apartment complex from the 1940s, partially renovated and rented out for cheap. It wasn't surprising that it attracted loners, college students, and low-income tenants like me. My apartment was on the ground floor, at the end of a long, dim hallway where the fluorescent lights flickered constantly. At the far end was a door leading to a shared auxiliary bathroom, something the landlord claimed was no longer in use, since each unit had its own main bathroom. That door was usually locked, but every time I passed it, I felt like someone was standing behind it. The first time I heard the flush was around 2 a.m. It came from the direction of that auxiliary bathroom. A clear, unmistakable sound. A toilet flush, then dripping. Then a silence that chilled me to the bone. I told myself it was probably just old pipes, or maybe someone playing a prank. But the next night, And the one after that, the sound came again, always at the same time, always with the same rhythm, like someone was using it. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Jane, the girl in the unit across from mine, started to act uneasy. She was a second-year art student, often up late painting. One evening, she knocked on my door, paintbrush still in hand, face pale. "You hear it too, don't you?" she whispered. "The water. From the old toilet?" I nodded, her expression tensed. "I saw someone's shadow through the crack under the door. I swear, Mark, it was small, like a child, but not like any child I've ever seen." The next morning, we reported it to Ray, the building manager. Ray was in his 60s, hunched, with a flushed face from too much alcohol. When we mentioned the water sounds, he just scoffed. "You kids and your imaginations. That room's been locked for years. Plumbing's disconnected. No one could use it." I asked if we could check inside. Ray shook his head and gave me a strange look. "You don't mess with what's already at rest." His words sent a chill down my spine. At rest? What was he implying? That night, Jane and I sneaked back down the hallway. We brought flashlights and a crowbar from the maintenance shed. The padlock on the door was older than I expected. After a few strong pulls, it snapped open. The door creaked open slowly, groaning as if protesting the intrusion. Inside was a small, narrow, damp room, peeling brick walls, cobweb-covered ceiling, and in the center, an ancient toilet, covered in dark moss and yellow stains. But what stunned us wasn't the decay. It was the cleanliness of the floor around it. No dust, no cobwebs, as if someone had been using it. Jane shone her flashlight into the bowl. Her hand trembled. "Mark, there's something in there. It's moving." I bent down, and I saw it. An eye, not water, not grime, but a large, round, human eye, staring back up at us from within the toilet. And then it blinked. We screamed, backed into the wall. Jane nearly collapsed. I grabbed her arm and pulled her out of the room. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The air around us felt like we'd just escaped the mouth of hell. We decided we wouldn't go back, wouldn't speak of it again. But it didn't end there. 2 nights later, Jane disappeared. Police came. They questioned everyone. They broke into her apartment. The lights were still on, her laptop still open, her latest painting still unfinished. But Jane was gone. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no screams, just one strange detail. Her bathroom floor was wet, though no faucet had been turned on. I went to find Ray, but his unit was empty, locked, covered in dust, as if no one had lived there in years. The panic grew each day. I started seeing strange reflections in mirrors, hearing the soft giggles of children through the air vents. And every time I turned on the faucet, I saw that eye again, in the shimmer of water, watching me. I knew I had to leave, but something wouldn't let me. One night I dreamt of Jane. She stood at the end of the dark hallway, water pouring from her eyes, her mouth, the torn cavity in her chest. She reached out her hand. "Mark, they're not full yet." I woke up drenched in sweat, and when I looked toward the door, it was slightly open. The toilet flushed, this time, very close, and I heard soft footsteps, small wet feet, walking down my hallway. Ever since Jane disappeared, I haven't been the same. Every little noise in the apartment makes me flinch. The wind howling through the window cracks, the ticking of the clock, even the hum of the air conditioner kicking in. It all makes my heart race. But there's one sound I cannot bear. The flush at 2 a.m. Still the same. Steady, haunting. I called the police again, insisting Jane didn't just leave, that I'd heard footsteps, seen things I couldn't explain. But they only looked at me with pity. One young officer named Brian eventually pulled me aside and whispered, "I investigated a case here too. 5 years ago, a college student went missing, no trace, and it was connected to that room." I grabbed his arm. "The one with the toilet?" Brian nodded, but before I could press for more, he pulled away and returned to his colleagues, leaving me standing alone in the long, silent hallway. I decided I wouldn't run anymore. That night, I prepared everything: flashlight, multi-tool knife, rope, and a notebook to document what I found. I taped a note to my door. "If I don't come back, don't open the toilet." At exactly 1:57 a.m., I left my room and returned to the auxiliary bathroom. The door looked the same. The new lock management had installed after the break-in was broken, snapped from the inside. I stepped in, my palms already slick with sweat. The air was thick, reeking of something rotten, and that metallic tang unmistakably like blood. I shined the light into the toilet. The eye was gone, but deep down I knew it was still watching. Somewhere in the dark, something was waiting. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I lifted the toilet lid. A blast of cold air hit me, so strong I staggered back. There was no water inside, only a deep, gaping black void, like the mouth of an endless pit. And then I saw something move inside. Not water, flesh, human flesh, writhing, twisting, as if the toilet were a throat, swallowing it whole. Then I heard crying, a child sobbing, faint, ghostly, but real. I don't know what made me lean closer. Maybe madness, maybe some desperate instinct that Jane was down there. I tied the rope around my waist, anchored it to the doorknob, and began lowering myself into that hole. Yes, it was insane. I knew that. But what would you do if the only person who ever believed you might be trapped in a place no one else believes even exists? I slid into the thick darkness, like descending into a damp, pulsing throat. The stench of rot and mold surrounded me. After a long drop, I landed on a cold stone floor. What I saw below was unlike anything I had imagined. It wasn't a sewer. It was a room made of stone. The ceiling low, the walls etched with strange carvings. Old rusted toilets lined the walls like shrines, some still leaking blood. And in the center of the room was Jane. She sat huddled, eyes vacant, hair tangled, limbs caked in dirt. I rushed to her. "Jane, it's me, Mark." She looked up, lips barely moving. "They're hungry." Before I could ask who they were, a deep groan rumbled from the left wall. From cracks in the stone, shadows began to crawl out. They had no defined form, but I saw their eyes. Dozens, hundreds of eyes, flickering hungrily. I grabbed Jane, trying to lift her. She resisted. "You don't understand. If one of us leaves, one has to stay." "No, I'm not leaving you here." "You don't get to choose, Mark. The toilet has to eat." That's when I felt something climb up my leg. Cold, slimy, unbelievably strong. I drew my knife and slashed wildly. Screeches echoed all around. I didn't know what I hit, but everything paused for a moment. I seized the chance, grabbed Jane, and shouted, "Let's go." I pushed her into the drain pipe, yelling as I lifted her. The rope was still intact. Jane climbed. I followed. But something grabbed my ankle. This time, it wasn't slime. It was bone, a skeletal hand, mummified and dry, but strong as steel. I kicked, thrashed, clawed at the walls until it finally let go. I scrambled up, shredded and filthy, my hands dripping with blood. Jane was at the top gasping, reaching down to pull me up. We collapsed together onto the bathroom floor as the door behind us slammed shut on its own. We survived. But something is still down there. The next day, management announced a full plumbing renovation and permanently sealed the auxiliary bathroom with concrete. I don't know who gave that order, but someone knew and someone chose silence. Jane moved away not long after, leaving no contact. Before she left, she said only one thing. If anyone asks about the flushing sounds, never say you heard them. I understood, because now, every time I turn on the shower, I feel someone watching me. And from the drain, I hear a flush, soft, but loud enough to remind me that toilet is still hungry. Ever since escaping the room below, I was no longer the same Mark. The wounds on my skin had healed, but something still clung to me. A memory, a sensation, a presence I couldn't sever, and it began again. Every night. The dreams. No, they were memories. I saw myself crawling out of the toilet, saw Jane sitting there, trembling, but each time, something was different. The withered hand no longer pulled at my leg, but gently stroked my back, as if a mother were lulling her child. And always, a whisper echoed near my ear. We were once human, before we were torn apart by forgetting. I began investigating. I needed to know what was down there. The old toilets, the living eye in the water, and especially those skeletal hands. They weren't ghosts, nor creatures. They had memory, purpose, and hatred. I went back to the Portland City Library and dug through every record about the apartment complex. After days of sifting through yellowed documents and moldy microfilm rolls, I found a newspaper clipping from 1952. The headline read, "4 women mysteriously vanish from underground women's detention camp in North Portland." A detention camp? I had never heard anyone mention that before. The article was brief, buried in the odd news section. It said that during the post-Popuk era, an underground facility had been built, part of the state prison system, used to hold inmates deemed beyond rehabilitation. Women, mostly mentally ill. Some were held without trial, without names. No one came to claim them. Among the list of the missing, one name made my blood run cold. Esther Malcolm. It matched a line I had seen carved into the stone wall beneath the toilet. I remembered it clearly. Esther was buried alive, but her hand remains. The hand still remains. I went to the City Land Records office, where old architectural blueprints were stored. Using the excuse of writing a paper on Portland housing history, a kind old clerk let me into the archive, and I found what I was looking for. The apartment building I lived in had been built atop the former site of Women's Penitentiary, number 70, dismantled in 1956, but only part of it was demolished. Most of the underground cells had been sealed off, including the subterranean detention wing. Back at my apartment, I felt the room tighten. The air thickened. The lights dimmed gradually. And then, one night, I saw it. A hand, not under the bed, not reaching out from the toilet like before. It grew from the wall, thin, shriveled fingers like charred branches, caked in dirt and dried blood. The hand slithered out, separating from the wall as if slipping between the borders of two worlds. I slammed the door shut. but the doorknob still burned cold in my palm. I couldn't sleep anymore. The next morning, I decided to find Brian, the young cop who had once spoken with me. After a few calls, I tracked him down at a small bar near the docks. He wasn't surprised to see me. I figured you'd be back. That underground prison, those women. Does anyone know what really happened? Brian took a sip of beer, then looked me straight in the eye. They didn't die from disease, not execution either. They died because they were abandoned. The guards locked the doors from above and sealed the exits with concrete because they were afraid of the singing. Singing? Those women didn't just scream. They sang in the dark when they were starving. And those songs, they weren't meant for human ears. I shuddered. I remembered the sounds I'd heard through the vents. Not crying, lullabies. I asked, and the hands? Why are they still alive? Brian paused for a long time before answering. They say when someone dies and the soul gets trapped within the walls, the body doesn't decay. It rots, yes, but the parts that most yearn for freedom, like the hands, keep trying to find a way out. That night I returned and did something insane. I went back into the underground room, this time to speak. I brought a recorder, an infrared light, and a silver prayer bead chain. Not to exercise, but to keep myself from going mad, following an old drainage route I'd found on the blueprints. It took me over an hour to reach the stone room again. Everything was as it was. But now, something new. The hands were no longer hiding. They sprouted everywhere, ceiling, walls, like brittle vines clinging to the structure. And then, they clapped, all at once. A sound like dry twigs cracking in chorus. Then a voice echoed, hoarse but clear. We were never buried. We were devoured by the memory of this world. I trembled, raised my recorder. What do you want? Silence. Then, a name. What name? The one who built the first toilet. Story 6. The Immortal Neighbor. I've lived my whole life in Elmridge, a small town in the northeastern US, where winters stretch on endlessly and old maple trees bleed red leaves every fall. If someone asked me what's most memorable about this place, I wouldn't mention the historic red brick high school or Mr. Gerald's worn-down ice cream shop. I would talk about her, my neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Ross, and the way she never grows old. I moved into 17 Maple Street in the spring of 1994, when I was just 7 years old. On my very first day, my mother warned me not to cross the street, to stay away from the faded white house with the weathered porch tangled in ivy, where Evelyn lived alone. She seems nice, I said, watching her water the plants. My mom shook her head, lips tight. No, Sarah, she's not what you think. I still remember exactly how Evelyn looked that day. Her silver hair neatly tied back, her pale, almost colorless skin, and her eyes. I don't even know how to describe them. As if she were looking through me. She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Her smile was cold, detached, like it wasn't connected to any feeling inside. I didn't think much of it back then. Just a lonely old lady, right? But that same year, a boy named Sammy, from my class, disappeared. Police found his jacket deep in the woods, 2 miles from my house. No blood, no clues. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The next year, another kid went missing, then another the year after. And just like that, as if caught in a twisted cycle, every year around mid-October, Elmbridge lost a child. People whispered, blaming wild animals, kidnappers, even cults, but I always remembered Evelyn's eyes through her dusty window. She always watched, always at night, always when the fog rolled in, and always something felt off in the air. I left for college in 2005, escaping Elmridge with the hope I'd never return. But life isn't that simple. After my divorce last year, I came back with my daughter Emma to the old house, trying to start over. She was 8, the same age I was when I first saw Evelyn. Strangely, when I returned, Evelyn looked exactly the same. No new wrinkles, no stoop to her back. Even the same ash-gray cardigan I remembered from childhood, as if time couldn't touch her. I dug out our old photo albums. 1995, 2010, even the one I took of her last month, in 2024. She looked identical, not a single change, not one mark of aging. I started asking the neighbors. They deflected, shrugged, or chuckled awkwardly. She must have good genes, someone joked. But no one really wanted to talk about Evelyn. I used to think my childhood memories were imagination. Until one chilly autumn evening, with wind rustling through the bare trees, Emma asked, "Mom, who's that lady?" I turned, following her finger. Evelyn was standing at her window, dimly lit from within. Her hand pressed against the glass. Not moving, not blinking, just staring, straight at our house. "Probably Mrs. Ross. Don't mind her," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. But inside, my heart started to pound. "I saw her in our yard last night," Emma whispered. "She said my name, but her mouth didn't move." That night I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop and searched for information about Evelyn. Nothing. No birth certificate. No medical records. No archived photos from before 1990. It was as if she only started existing when I was a child. No one knew her before that. I reached out to a friend at the town hall, asked him to check the records for 18 Maple, the house Evelyn lived in. The next day, he messaged back, said the file had gone missing. But there was one strange thing. The original land ownership document listed Evelyn Ross as the homeowner in 1894. I froze. 130 years ago. Then came the dreams. Children, blurry, lost, standing at Evelyn's gate, whispering nonsense into the wind. Emma began to change too. She drew pictures of Evelyn standing in the center of a candle circle, holding strands of hair from children's heads. I asked where she learned it. She said, "I didn't learn it. I saw it, like..." She showed me. A chill ran down my spine. One night, with the moon hidden by thick clouds and the wind howling like a dying breath across the neighborhood, I saw Emma at the front door. Her eyes were blank. Her hand was on the doorknob. "I'm opening it for her," she said. I rushed to pull her away. But outside, Evelyn was already there, silent, still. A smile too wide to be human, and her eyes reflected no light. I locked the door, pulled the curtains shut, but when I turned around, Emma was gone. The back door stood wide open, and far away, through the cold mist, I heard an old, raspy lullaby. "Sleep now, sleep tight. Grandma will keep you safe tonight." Emma disappeared on the night of October 15th. The police came, flashlights sweeping the yard, K9 units sniffing the dried blood on the back steps. My blood from when I tried to pull her away from the door, and failed. I sat frozen in the living room, trembling, beneath the flickering lights and the static crackle of police radios. No one believed me. I told them everything. About Mrs. Evelyn, about those unchanging eyes for 3 decades, about the missing children and the lullaby that whispered through the mist. They thought I was paranoid. One officer even asked carefully, "Are you currently on any psychiatric medication, Sarah?" But I knew what I saw was real. I knew Emma was inside the house across the street. 2 days later, the police suspended the active search. The official reason: insufficient evidence of foul play, possible runaway or abduction outside jurisdiction. But me, I plastered Emma's picture across the town, asked every store, every passerby. No one had seen her. I began watching house number 18. On the 3rd day after Emma vanished, I saw Mrs. Evelyn leave the house. Something that had never happened before. She wore a long dark brown coat, a wide-brimmed hat, and walked down the street, slowly but steadily, like someone who never grew tired. I waited until she turned the corner and disappeared. Then I ran across the street. The old wooden gate opened without a sound. Ivy wrapped around the porch like withered arms, intertwining as if to trap anyone trying to enter. I knocked. No answer. I pushed gently. The door opened. A musty, stale scent hit my face. The smell of a basement sealed for decades, but ahead wasn't a basement. It was the living room. Faded rose-patterned wallpaper lined the walls. A wall clock frozen at 2:16. Everything coated in dust, as if time had stopped inside. And yet, everything was too clean. No cobwebs, no rodent droppings. And even though the clock had stopped, I could hear faint ticking from somewhere deeper within. I crept through each room. Dining area, kitchen, hallway to the backyard. No Emma, no signs. Until I reached the 2nd floor. The staircase spiraled upward. I ascended, hands shaking, clutching the old wooden railing. There were 3 doors upstairs, one on each side, and one at the end of the hallway. I tried the first door, a bedroom. On the bed sat rows of old cloth dolls. Each had a name embroidered on its chest. Olivia, 2006. Mason, 2011. Lily, 2019. And one nameless doll, wearing a pink dress, identical to what Emma wore the night she vanished. I nearly screamed, but held it in. I couldn't let Mrs. Evelyn know I was here. I rushed to the 2nd door. An empty room, curtains drawn tight. Nothing unusual. The final door. The one without a lock. No handle, no hinges. Just a seamless wooden surface, embedded into the wall, but underneath a narrow gap, and from that gap I smelled burnt wood and something metallic, like dried blood. I crouched down, peered through the slit. Inside was a stone room. Symbols covered the walls, circles, triangles, glyphs resembling ancient Egyptian script. At the center was a ring of white salt, and within that circle sat a wooden chair. And on it, something moved. A child. Emma. She was tied to the chair with braided strands of human hair. Eyes shut, mouth murmuring as if dreaming. And behind her, something crawled in the shadows. I stumbled back, heart pounding. Just then, I heard footsteps. Heavy dragging steps from downstairs. I was out of time. I hid inside the wardrobe of the first room, surrounded by the scent of mothballs and old cloth. Through the slats, I saw her. Mrs. Evelyn entered. She wasn't old. Not aging, but ageless. Her face was smooth, pale, emotionless, like a porcelain mask, but her eyes, this time I saw them clearly, were completely black, no whites, no pupils. She stood in front of the mirror and had no reflection. Then she spoke, a language that didn't sound like anything human. The room dimmed, and the mirror began to crack, leaking black fluid onto the floor. "This child will sustain me for another 30 years, she said. My heart nearly exploded. I waited until she left the room, then bolted from the wardrobe. I knew I couldn't rescue Emma alone, but I needed proof. Someone had to believe me. I raised my phone, filming every corner, every object, even the door without a lock. But when I opened the camera, the screen went pitch black. No image, no light, nothing recorded. I turned around, devastated, and there she was, Mrs. Evelyn, standing right behind me, just one step away. I don't remember how I got out of that house, just that I threw up on the sidewalk, hands trembling, heart racing. The police didn't believe me, but I knew my daughter was still alive, being kept as part of some ritual, just like the children before. I couldn't wait. I had to break the ritual, break the door with no lock. And the first thing I needed was someone who used to live there. I started digging through the town library archives the next day. Fever, obsession, and fear gnawed at my mind every hour, every minute. The police had begun to look at me with pity in their eyes. But I didn't care. Emma was still alive. I knew it. I could feel it. And I also knew, if I didn't do something soon, she would never come back. In the Elmridge Town Library, dust coated the bookshelves, and most people only cared about old cookbooks or hiking maps. But deep in the records room, where I had to get special permission to enter, there was a cabinet containing residential records from the 19th century. I started with the name Evelyn Ross. Nothing. Then I tried searching the previous owners of the house at 18 Maple Street, and I found it. Benjamin Alcott. Year of ownership, 1888. Occupation, Professor of Symbolic Studies and Occultism at Dartmouth College. I kept digging, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of light. A decaying newspaper clipping from the Elmridge Gazette, published October 23rd, 1895. Professor Alcott reports the disappearance of his daughter, young Eleanor, aged 9, on the night of October 15th. The father claims she was taken in an ancient ritual of worshippers of immortality. Authorities declined to comment. I gripped the article tightly, my heart pounding. The date of disappearance, an exact match, and what he said, a ritual of those who worship immortality. Mrs. Evelyn. The door without a lock. The dolls named after every child. I found Benjamin Alcott's final resting place in the cemetery on the north side of town. But it wasn't just his grave. Next to his was a small headstone that read, Eleanor Alcott, 1886, Apib. No date of death, no closing line, as if she never died. I nearly collapsed beside the grave. Then I heard the sound of wheels crunching gravel behind me. An old wheelchair, pushed by an elderly man with a long silver beard, wrapped in a worn wool coat. "You looking for Alcott?" he asked, voice frail but sharp. I nodded, hesitating. "You knew him?" The man let out a dry chuckle. "He was my great-grandfather. Name's Daniel. Daniel Alcott." We talked on a cold stone bench under an old maple tree. Daniel seemed hesitant at first, but when I mentioned the name Evelyn Ross, his eyes widened as if I had awakened something that had lain dormant in his mind for decades. "She wasn't human," he said. "She was something pretending to be." I told him everything about Emma, the strange dreams, the stone room, and the ritual in the dark. With every word I spoke, his face paled further. My great-grandfather. He tried to break that ritual, but he failed. After losing Eleanor, he lived in seclusion and died alone, holding on to the belief that one day Someone would find a way to free the children. I swallowed hard. Is there a way? Anything to bring Emma back? Daniel stared at me for a long time, then pulled from his coat pocket a worn leather notebook, faded by time. This is my great-grandfather's journal, but be careful, some pages. They're not meant to be read aloud, not unless you want to wake something that's sleeping. I took the journal home. In my bedroom, under the dim yellow light, I turned each page. Slanted handwriting filled the entries about symbols, rituals, black fire, grey salt, and something called the Watcher Between Worlds. Alcott described an ancient ritual of the Society of Eternal Life, a group believed to have operated secretly in Vermont during the 18th and 19th centuries. They believed that to sustain life beyond time, the soul of a child must be offered during every black moon cycle in mid-October. That soul would then be trapped outside the physical world, in a dimensional layer called the reflective veil. If the ritual was completed, the child would vanish forever. If interrupted, the guardian entity would rise and pull the intruder down in their place. I shivered as I read the part describing the eye in the darkness. Always watching, always whispering. At the end of the journal was a rough floor plan of 18 Maple Street. A hasty note below it. The door, without a lock. It's actually a spatial gateway. The key lies in the final reflection, the mirror without an image. I knew I had to go back. That night I brought salt, a small hand mirror, and the journal. I snuck into Evelyn's house. This time through the back, using a key I had stolen from a plumber's key ring left on the porch the day before. The house was pitch dark. No sounds, no one. I crept upstairs to the door with no lock. I pressed the mirror against the wall, just like the journal instructed. Nothing happened. I stepped back. Then, in the mirror, I saw the door slowly creak open, but only in the mirror. In the real world, the door remained shut. My heart stopped. In the mirror, beyond the door, was a long hallway lit by candles, lined with shattered mirrors and warped children's laughter echoing in the distance. I realized the door only opened to a reflection. I turned the mirror toward myself, then reached out and touched the glass. It was freezing cold, but soft like water. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The feeling of stepping through the mirror was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It didn't hurt, but it was so cold, it felt like the blood was being drained from my body. Not the kind of cold you get from winter wind, but the kind that made it feel like I had just left the world of the living behind. I entered a long hallway. No ceiling, no floor, just mirrors, walls, ground, and the very air around me all reflected endless distorted versions of myself, blurry and warped. But what took my breath away was the light. Each mirror reflected a faint candle glow, yet no candles were actually present. Only light, flickering, misplaced, sourceless. Every step I took echoed back, but it wasn't just footsteps. I heard children's laughter, sometimes far, sometimes near, sometimes right behind me. "Emma?" I called out, my voice cracked and raw. No answer, only mirrors, and the reflections that began to move out of sync with me. I started walking faster, but didn't dare to run. It felt like if I moved too quickly, the things inside the mirrors wouldn't keep up, and I didn't want to know what would happen if I stepped wrong, or if one of the reflections decided to move ahead of me. Eventually, the hallway opened into a chamber. I didn't know what to call it. It resembled an upside-down chapel. Twisted columns dangled from the ceiling rather than rising from the ground. The walls were lined with picture frames, but the photos were all empty. Inside each frame was a mirror surface, and as I approached, they didn't reflect me. They reflected Emma. Frame after frame showed moments, like scenes cut from a film. In one, Emma was crying. In another, she'd fallen asleep on the wooden chair I remembered, but the final image froze my heart. Emma was standing, eyes wide open, pupils pitch black, mouth moving in words that weren't English. Behind her stood Mrs. Evelyn, no longer human. She was twice as tall, hair cascading down to the floor, her mouth stretched ear to ear, and her hands were riddled with fingers as long as withered tree roots. I turned and ran, slamming into a cold stone column. When I regained my footing, a child stood at the far end of the room, a girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing a white dress, brown curls, and I felt my heart stop. "Emma?" I breathed. She looked up, but that face wasn't right. It resembled Emma, but just barely, like a flawed copy, eyes spaced too far apart, a frozen smile, and skin pale as paper. "I've been waiting for you, Mommy," it said, but the voice wasn't my daughter's. It was an adult's voice, deep, resonant, like echoing from the bottom of a well. I stepped back. "You're not my daughter." It smiled. "No, but you'll have to become me if you want your daughter to return." The floor began to tremble. Mirrors cracked. Shards fell from above like snow, but didn't hit the ground. They hovered in midair, fusing together into a new doorway. The copy of Emma drifted toward me. Its feet didn't touch the floor. It glided as if pulled by invisible threads. I stood frozen. Behind it, I heard whispers, unintelligible but constant, like 100 voices murmuring all at once. Ancient chants slithering into my mind. I pulled out the pouch of salt and threw a handful toward the copy. It shrieked, a sound like wind scraping across rusted metal. Its skin began to crack, like wax melting under heat. "You don't belong here," I said. "Give me back my daughter." Wind rose. Wind in a place with no windows. The entire room shook. Picture frames crashed to the floor. In the last mirror, I saw the real Emma. Eyes wide open, mouth stitched shut with black thread, hands bound tight. I screamed, "Emma! It's Mommy!" And then a voice boomed through the chamber. "You've entered the realm of reflections. No one leaves without leaving behind a piece of their soul." I didn't know where the voice came from, but I knew. It was Evelyn, only older, colder, less than human. I remembered the final page of the diary. To break the ritual, the roles must be switched. Deceive the gatekeeper with its own reflection. A soul must offer itself willingly, but must not be bound by a blood oath. I took out my hand mirror, turned it toward the Emma copy. The reflection wasn't of her. It was me, but smiling in a twisted, unnatural way. I understood. I turned the mirror toward the frame holding the real Emma. The glass flashed, then melted like mercury. In that moment, I thought of Emma. The day she was born, the first time she called me Mommy, her laughter at the park. And I said loudly, "Take me, let her go." Silence. All the mirrors shattered. The Emma copy crumbled into ash, and from the wreckage, a new portal opened. Beyond it, my living room. Emma tumbled through, real, flesh and blood, her eyes wide, sobbing, calling my name. I wrapped my arms around her, but the moment I touched her, black smoke coiled around my legs, pulling me back. I only had time to whisper, "I'm okay," run, and never look back. And then I was dragged into the other side, to the place where mirrors no longer reflect, to the place untouched by time. The door closed behind me. Story 7. Don't answer the doll when it says, "Mom, I used to think things like child spirits only existed in movies." That was until I heard the first voice at exactly 2:14 a.m. coming from the room that had been locked for an entire year. My name is Kelly Morgan, 34 years old, living in Vermont, a small state filled with shadowy forests and winters that last half the year. My house sits about 20 minutes outside the main town of Elmridge, isolated, quiet, and perfect for a small family. At least it was, until my daughter Ellie died. She passed away in a car accident. It happened right outside our gate, while I was distracted on the phone and let her run across the road to check the mailbox. Ellie was only 6 years old. After the funeral, I disappeared from life. People came to visit, sent flowers, food, even healing books. But nothing could patch the cold, hollow space inside me. I packed all her belongings into the old room upstairs, locked the door, and swore I'd never go in again. There was only one thing I didn't put away. Her cloth doll, Marnie, Ellie's favorite toy. I left it in the room, sitting silently on the rocking chair by the window. A year passed, and on the 364th night since Ellie died, something strange began. I woke up in the middle of the night, unsure why. My phone was still charging, no notifications. The clock read 2:16 a.m. Then I heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. At first I assumed it was the wood cracking from thawing snow. Springtime made that happen often. But something about the sound sent ice through my spine. A voice, soft, weak, and cold as winter wind, slipping through the cracks. "Mommy, I'm cold. I want to come home." I held my breath. The voice came clearly from upstairs, from Ellie's room. I tried to stay calm. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe a neighbor. Had their TV on too loud? But no. The closest house was half a mile away, and I had turned off every light and device before bed. I stepped out of bed, my bare feet touching the freezing wooden floor. The creaking continued. The rocking chair. I climbed the stairs, heart pounding. Each step moaned beneath my weight. I didn't turn on the light, partly from fear, partly to avoid shattering the strange, thick atmosphere hanging in the house. When I reached Ellie's room, I realized it was slightly open. I hadn't touched that door since that day. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The room was exactly as it had been a year ago. Pastel blue walls, star and moon curtains, the little bed with the cat-shaped pillow. But one thing was different. The rocking chair was moving gently, and on it was Marnie. The doll was still there, head tilted, yarn hair messy, and black button eyes gleaming like they'd just been polished. I stepped closer, cautiously. Then it spoke again. The voice didn't come from anywhere visible. It seemed to echo from within the doll itself. "Mommy, I'm cold." I screamed and stumbled back, nearly falling. But no one answered. There was no one in the house except me and the doll. I brought Marnie down to the kitchen that very night, intending to throw her into the fireplace. But I couldn't lift the iron grate. Some part of me, some irrational part, was terrified of what might happen if I destroyed it. I placed her on the dining table instead, covering her with a cloth. Then I sat there until dawn, eyes locked on the covered mound of fabric, not daring to blink. 2 days later, I brought Mani to the only antique store in the area, Salem's Attic, located on the outskirts of Elmridge. The owner was an old woman named Agatha, her hair silver like mist, one eye clouded over. When I took the doll out, she glanced at it and immediately stood up. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling, full of unease. "From my daughter's room. It was her old toy." Agatha said nothing. She disappeared behind the counter and returned with a worn leather book. She opened it to a marked page, flagged by a scorched photo, and slid it toward me. The black and white photo showed a blurry little girl holding a doll, identical to Mani. Scrawled on the back in faded ink, Mani, stitched from funeral shroud fabric. Must not be kept near children for more than 7 days. My face went pale, but Agatha continued slowly, like reciting a cursed lullaby. "This doll once belonged to another girl who died in 1911. Her family heard voices at night too. Later, the mother vanished without a trace. 5 months passed before they found her in the cellar, still holding Mani, smiling, and her hair had turned completely white. That night, I decided to leave the house and stay at a motel near town. But when I got to my car, all 4 tires had been slashed. The cuts were deep, precise, as if someone or something had deliberately made sure I couldn't leave. Then, as I stepped back into the house, I heard the voice again. This time, from right behind me, just a few feet away. "Mommy, I want to come home." I spun around. No one. But on the floor, leading from the front door up the stairs, were wet, tiny footprints, bare, child-sized, and ice-cold. I didn't sleep that night. Even though the world outside was frozen and snow had piled high enough to block the path entirely, I sat, curled up in the kitchen, clutching a kitchen knife as if it could protect me from something my mind still refused to name. That voice, "Mommy, I want to come home," echoed in my head like an old recording on loop. And each time it played, I shivered, not out of fear, but because it felt too real. It didn't sound like something from the radio, the TV, or the fevered dreams of a grieving mother. It felt like a soul standing just behind me, calling? No, begging me to bring it back. The next morning, the snow stopped. I called a mechanic to replace the tires. While waiting, I locked the Mani doll in a wooden box, wrapped it with 3 layers of rope, and placed it in the storage closet out in the garage. The coldest place in the house. I wasn't going to keep it anymore. No matter what it took, I had to find out what was truly happening with this doll. I returned to Agatha's shop around noon. Despite the freezing air, she sat at her table, eyes closed, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, as if she'd been expecting me. "I need to know more," I said, not beating around the bush. "About the doll, about the girl from 1911, and why did you call her Mani, even though I never mentioned that name?" She didn't open her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Because that's what she used to call me." I stepped back. "You were not the last to keep her, but the first to hear her, after more than 50 years of silence." She opened her eyes then, a strange, clouded gaze. "I was the child who survived when the house burned down in 1963. That house belonged to my aunt. The woman in the photograph you saw. According to Agatha, in 1963, she was sent to live with her aunt after her parents passed away. The house was deep in the woods, and like me, she had been warned never to go down into the basement. But one day, she said, I heard crying, exactly like the voice that called to you. Mommy, I'm cold. I thought someone was trapped down there. I opened the door, and I saw it. The doll lying in the center of a circle of ash, eyes black as coal. Every time I looked into them, I saw myself. Agatha shivered, paused, then continued. My aunt disappeared 3 days later. When the police arrived, the house was already burning. The fire had started in the basement. I was the only one who survived. Because that night, I'd been sleeping on the porch as punishment. Her story sent chills down my spine. If what she said was true, then Mani wasn't just an antique toy. It was a vessel, a conduit for someone or something trying to return. I drove straight to the town library, combed through old records. After nearly 3 hours of digging through crumbling papers, I found a small article from 1911. A young girl named Emmeline Worth, age 7, went missing after her mother, Clara Worth, stitched her a doll using fabric from her grandmother's funeral dress. Both were believed to have been called back by ancestral spirits. Clara's body was discovered in the basement. Emmeline was never found. Burial cloth, mourning dress, the first doll. Emmeline vanished. Goosebumps crawled across my skin. Something was deeply wrong with that toy. And what terrified me most was this. Ellie wasn't the first to hear the voice. I returned home as snow began to fall again. But the moment I stepped inside, I froze. The garage door was wide open. I ran, heart pounding. The storage closet, torn apart. The ropes, sliced clean, not frayed like mouse bites or decayed, but with something sharp. And the wooden box was empty. The doll was gone. Just then I heard a soft giggle. From upstairs, a child's laugh. I grabbed the kitchen knife, crept upstairs one step at a time, heart thudding like a drum. When I reached Ellie's room, the door slowly swung open on its own. No one touching it. Inside, every old toy had been neatly arranged, as if someone had just finished playing with them. Everything was in its place, except Mani, sitting on the bed, facing the door. Her black button eyes staring directly at me. Right then, the lights went out. A rustling sound came from just behind me. I spun around. No one there, but at my feet, cold, soaking wet footprints. Small ones, leading straight to the basement. I had never opened the basement since moving in, but the wooden door beneath the kitchen was now wide open, and from below, a lullaby echoed up, muffled, like it was rising from the earth itself. Sleep, my child. Sleep, my dear. Mommy's here now. I stood frozen. The chill no longer came from the weather. It came from within, as if another soul had begun to take my place. And then, a tiny icy hand reached out and held mine from behind. I don't remember exactly how it felt when that small hand touched mine. All I know is, it was cold enough to make me jerk back, but it didn't grip or pull me down. It just touched me, like how a child might reach out for their mother in a hazy dream. I turned around. No one. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale light of the kitchen bulb above, casting faint shadows over the cracked walls. But my hand still felt frozen. That sensation didn't go away, as if something had latched onto my skin, clinging to me with every step. I stood before the basement door for what felt like forever. Time seemingly frozen. That lullaby was still there, soft, rhythmic, gentle, as if drifting in from an entirely different world. It wasn't eerie, it wasn't spine-chilling. But that calmness was the most terrifying part. I don't remember how many steps I took descending. All I knew was the basement was colder than I could have imagined. So cold that a fog, thin as smoke, blanketed the floor. There was no real light, just a dim flicker from a lone filament bulb above, blinking, flickering in a steady rhythm like counting down the moments I had left in my sanity. And then I saw the ring of ash. Right in the middle of the moldy cement floor, a blackened circle of soot. So old, it looked like it had existed long before the house itself. Inside the circle was a child's dress, faded pink, so worn that the threads were falling apart like dust. Beside it, Mani sat, her head tilted, mouth painted with a crooked smile, and those black button eyes, like bottomless holes. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I just stood there, drawn in like a moth to flame. Then, from behind me, Ellie's voice echoed. But it wasn't weak anymore. Not broken. Not robotic like before. Mom, you really came down to find me? I spun around. A child stood there. Ellie's figure exactly, checkered dress, gently curled hair, those pale blue eyes, and her face. But something was off. That face didn't move, no emotion, as if something was wearing her skin, pretending to be her. I fought to keep my voice steady. Are you Ellie? The child nodded, but the movement, too smooth, too precise, not like a real child. She stepped closer, whispering, I'm so cold. Hold me, Mom. I stepped back. The bulb above us went out. Pitch black. The lullaby returned, but this time from many voices, as if dozens of children were whispering right into my ears. Sleep, child. Sleep, child. I don't know when I passed out. When I woke up, I was in bed, in Ellie's room. The place was spotless. Everything neatly arranged, too perfect. I had no memory of walking back up. No idea who brought me there. But the strangest thing, Mani was lying in my arms, her tall hands wrapped around mine like a child, hugging her mother. I screamed and flung her to the floor, then ran out of the room. But when I reached the front door, it was locked. From the outside, no signal on my phone, lights flickering, and then the living room TV turned on by itself. No image, just grey static. But from it came laughter. Ellie's laugh, and then my husband's. Mark, who died in a fire 3 years ago. Mom, Dad's cold too. Kelly, why didn't you save me? I collapsed onto the floor. I didn't know what was real, what was hallucination, or if everything was just a trap, something twisting the past to invade the present. That night, I barely slept, just minutes, on and off. In my dreams, I saw Ellie sitting in the basement, clutching Mani, surrounded by eyeless children who kept calling me Mom. And then I saw my own face, empty, hollow. The next morning, I went to Father Thomas, the priest who had presided over Ellie's funeral. I had never believed in exorcisms or cleansing rituals. But now, I had nothing left to lose. Father Thomas listened to everything. The nighttime whispers, the wet footprints, the frozen basement. He didn't ask many questions. He simply pulled out a small leather-bound book and told me to take him to the house that very night. As we stepped inside, the power cut out, the air turned thick, frozen. Father Thomas opened the book and began to pray. But the moment he uttered In nomine Patris, the house shook like an earthquake. Frames shattered off the walls, Kitchen cabinets burst open. The basement door slammed wide without anyone touching it. From below, hundreds of tiny hands reached up like something was trying to climb back out of hell. Father Thomas shouted, "That's not a child. That thing isn't your daughter." I saw Ellie's face rise from the basement shadows. And for the first time, it smiled. A smile that split across her face, stretching ear to ear, revealing a mouth full of metal teeth. I don't remember what Father Thomas did after that. I just know he collapsed. And I ran to the garage, grabbed the gas can, poured it all down the basement stairs, and tossed in a lit match. The flames roared. I heard screams. Not just one, but many. And for a moment, I saw her. A silver-haired woman holding Ellie, tears in her eyes, standing in the circle of ash. Then they vanished into the fire. Most of the house was burned. I survived. But from that night on, the whispers were gone. No more wet footprints. No more Ellie. Only sometimes, in the middle of the night, when I wake up, I feel someone gently wrap their arms around me from behind and whisper, "I'm home now. Please don't cry, Mom." Story 8. The Death Angle. My name is Cameron Wells, 31 years old. I live alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana. Winters here are long and quiet. Maybe that's why I've grown used to the silence. So much so that even the odd noises in the night no longer startled me. But that night, March 14th, everything began in a way I still can't explain. I woke up at exactly 2:16 a.m. I know it was exact because the red digital numbers on the bedside clock were still blinking brightly in the dark. At first, I thought the buzzing came from my phone. Probably just a notification or some random alert. But when I reached for it, the screen displayed a strange notification that made me go cold. Live now, Cameron Wells. 2 viewers. I didn't remember ever starting a live stream. I hadn't even touched the camera app, let alone broadcast anything while I slept. My heartbeat quickened as I tapped the notification. What appeared on the phone screen almost made me drop it. The camera was pointed directly at my bed, at me while I was sleeping. The angle was from the foot of the bed, about head height, tilted slightly downward, as if someone was standing there, or as if a camera had been set up on a tripod. But my room was empty. Always had been. I checked obsessively every night before going to bed. No hidden cameras, no recording devices. I was sure of it, but what chilled me even more was this. The bed in the live stream was empty. No sign of me, no blankets pulled back, no pillow creases. Yet here I was, sitting on that very bed in the real world, phone in hand, trembling in the dark. I bolted out of the room, my hands shaking, turning on every light in the apartment. That's when I heard it. The Reolink doorbell chime. Something, or someone, had just passed in front of the camera outside my front door. I opened the app and reviewed the footage. Timestamp, 2:17 a.m. A blurry figure stood at my doorstep. It was there for no more than 3 seconds. Then it vanished. No footsteps, no turning away. Just stood there, head tilted hard to one side, like it had snapped. I swear to God, I've never seen anything that made my chest tighten like that. The face was obscured, but the neck bent at nearly a 90-degree angle. Long hair draped over the face, motionless. And then it faded, like it had never been there at all. I searched every corner of the apartment. Windows locked, Back door locked. No signs of forced entry. I couldn't call the cops. What was I supposed to tell them? That some anonymous live stream was showing a camera feed of my own room. Without me in it, no one would believe that. So I decided to sleep in the living room with all the lights on, phone in hand, watching every camera feed on repeat. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., something worse happened. The live stream app updated. Viewers 3. I hadn't shared the link. My account was set to private. No friends online at that hour. So, who was watching? I tapped into the stream again. This time, someone was on the bed. Not me, but someone who looked exactly like me. I was lying there, turned slightly away. But I could see the messy hair, the same gray t-shirt I wore yesterday, and a small scar near the collarbone. Something only I had. I reached to tap the screen, to shut it down. But then, the person in the video opened his eyes. No, looked directly at the camera. And then he smiled. A smile too wide, stretching unnaturally close to the ears, as if someone had cut the corners of the mouth with a blade and then forced a grin into it. Unnatural. Inhuman. I shut off the phone and threw it onto the couch. Ran to the balcony. I needed air. I needed clarity. That's when the wind caught something beneath the sliding door. A piece of paper shoved under the frame. It was thin, aged, and had one sentence, scribbled in uneven handwriting. This time, it's a live stream. Next time, it will be real. The next morning, I tried telling my co-worker, Megan, just a portion of the story. She was the only person at work I really trusted. But after just a few sentences, she interrupted. Cam, did you post some creepy video last night? 2 people sent me a link this morning. Said there was a weird live stream. But when I clicked it, the video was gone. I froze. I never shared that video. So who did? Worse, when I got home and checked my phone, the entire live stream history, all saved footage, even the account itself, was gone. Like it had never existed. I started writing everything down in a notebook. The only thing I believed couldn't be erased remotely. I also installed real security cameras around the apartment, changed every lock, and set up motion sensors on each window. But that night, the cameras recorded nothing. No movement, no sound, except in the shadowy corner of one clip, something stood still, watching. No movement, no approach, just stood there, silent. But the following night, it got closer. I thought the second night would be easier. That installing real cameras, replacing the locks, and leaving the lights on all night would give me some minimum sense of security. But nothing could have truly prepared me for what happened next. I sat in front of my computer screen around 3 a.m., replaying footage from one of the security cameras. It was placed in the living room, aimed at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Near the end of the clip, a faint silhouette appeared. At first, it was just a shadow in the spot where the light didn't quite reach. But when I zoomed in and slowed the footage, I saw it clearly. The shape of a woman, long hair, head tilted at an unnatural angle. She stood there, unmoving. But as I replayed the clip again, my eyes caught something odd on the wall behind her, as if something was being written there. A sequence of numbers, very faint. It took me nearly an hour, adjusting the contrast and filters to make it out. 731, 482, 1974. A part of me wanted to ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen it. But curiosity and fear pushed me to find out what it meant. I searched the sequence on Google, thinking it could be a zip code or an old phone number. Nothing matched, but then I broke it into date format, 7/31/1974, and an old news article popped up. A local archive, no pictures, just a short, chilling note. July 31st, 1974. A family of 3 found dead inside their home on Briar Hollow Road, Elmridge. No signs of forced entry, no suspects. Police suspect a group suicide, though neighbors reported seeing strange lights from the windows at exactly 2:16 a.m. 2:16 a.m. Again, that number. The exact time I was awakened by the first live stream. I found the address. It was just over a 45-minute drive north, in the outskirts of Elmridge, a place that had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. I don't know what compelled me to go there. Maybe because I felt if I didn't face it, I would never sleep peacefully again. I left my house just before 4 a.m. The sky still pitch black. On the way, I tried calling Megan. She didn't pick up, but I left her a voicemail, something like, "If anything happens to me." It all started with that live stream, and something really bad is happening in Elmridge. I arrived before sunrise. The road leading to the house was covered in old snow with deep tire tracks from someone who had come before me. House number 1974, Briar Hollow, emerged from behind a line of thin trees, like grey hands reaching into the sky. The house was old, sagging, the front door slightly ajar. Fresh footprints still marked the steps, not yet melted. I stepped inside. The door groaned like it was mourning something. Inside, it was suffocatingly cold, so cold I could see my breath. The air smelled heavy, like mold, like rusted iron, and something else. Raw meat. The living room was coated in dust, but oddly, the wooden floor near the fireplace was spotless, as if someone had stood there all night. I walked closer and touched the wall nearby. A message was scrawled in something dry and brownish black. "Camp has arrived." I nearly dropped the flashlight. How did they know my name? How did they know I would come? A sound came from upstairs. Footsteps, clear, slow, heavy. I froze for nearly a minute, considered leaving. But then, a faint glow emerged from the hallway, like someone was live streaming again. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. At the end of the hall was a half-open door, blue light leaking through, the glow of a phone screen. I pushed it gently. Inside the old bedroom, a phone sat upright on a table, camera facing the bed, streaming live. The screen read, "Lift House, 3 viewers," and in the corner, a single bed, empty, but on the live stream screen, I could see clearly. Someone was lying there. Me, again. This time, the me on screen was staring at the ceiling, eyes wide open, mouth torn into an unnatural grin that stretched ear to ear. A hollow stare, as if there was no soul left inside. I turned to run, but in the old mirror hanging on the wall, I saw it. A figure passed behind me. I spun around. No one there. But the mirror doesn't lie. On the live stream, the version of me had now sat up slowly, no effort, no arms used, as if something invisible had pulled it upright. I couldn't take it anymore. I smashed the phone. But in that very moment, the room went dark. Panic took over. I bolted down the stairs, slammed into the wall. The front door locked tightly from the outside. Helpless, I looked through the window. In the snow outside, a new trail of footprints had appeared, leading into the house, no tracks going out. I don't remember exactly how I got out. When I came to, I was lying in a local hospital, arms scratched and 3 stitches on my forehead. The police said a passerby found me wandering near the edge of the woods, muttering things no one could understand. Megan came to visit. She said that right when I went missing, my account started reposting the live stream, this time showing me sleeping in that same house in Elbridge. But there was no camera. And the most horrifying part, the live stream hasn't stopped. Every night, a new video appears and someone, or something, is using my image to replace me. I was kept in the hospital for 3 days, and during those 3 days, I couldn't sleep, not even for an hour. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself, the other version, lying on that old bed in Elmridge, eyes wide open, staring straight into the camera. The worst part was, the live stream hadn't stopped. Megan, who tried her best to keep me calm, couldn't hide her fear. She said the latest video had gone live at exactly 2:16 a.m., just like before. But this time, it wasn't just me lying motionless. The figure in the stream had started to move. It got out of bed, walked toward the camera, then stopped right in front of the lens. Just stood there, staring. No speaking, no blinking, no turning away. Just standing, staring. For 32 straight minutes. I was discharged on the 4th day. The doctor diagnosed me with acute post-traumatic stress, but admitted the scratches and bruises on my body couldn't be explained by simple sleepwalking. He advised total rest, no screens, no social media. I listened, at least for the first 2 hours after getting home. Then I discovered something that made my heart stop. My old laptop, one I'd locked away in the closet, had turned on by itself. It had launched OBS Studio, the live stream software I used back when I worked in video editing. The program was running, streaming live via the built-in webcam. I had never turned it on. It was plugged in, sure, but the recording light had been on who knows how long. The live stream was broadcasting to a nameless platform, showing the message, "Live the thing in the lens or viewers." I shut it down, removed the battery, pulled the power cable. But the image kept showing. On the black, powered-off screen, a blurry frame emerged, as if the screen was now reflecting this very room, even though the device had no power. And then, within that reflection, a door, the closet door right behind me, began to slowly creak open, slow, groaning, no wind, no one else in the house. I didn't dare turn around. All I could do was stare at the dead laptop. In that reflected screen, a pale arm reached out, thin, gaunt, fingers unnaturally long, no nails, and then it vanished. That's when I started investigating for real. I had no choice. I needed to know what was following me and why it chose me. On some old forums dedicated to the paranormal, I stumbled across a post from 2009 by an anonymous user. The title simply read, "Don't let it record you. The thing in the lens doesn't show its real face." The post was a list of bizarre incidents stretching across decades, from the northern states to the southeast. A shared pattern. Victims discovered they were being live-streamed while sleeping. No camera, no equipment, no traces left behind. Weeks later, they vanished. No witnesses, no goodbye. But the live streams kept appearing. Some were even seen in the footage after they had died in real life. I dug into every name listed. One was Elijah Barnes, 26, disappeared in Vermont in 1985. Another was Renee Choi, a Korean student who vanished in Seattle in 2002. She had filed a police report saying someone was live streaming her from inside her dorm, even though her door was locked from the inside. A photo attached to the post froze me in place. A screenshot from an old video showing a man sleeping. The camera angle set low at the foot of the bed, exactly like mine. But the most horrifying detail, at the edge of the frame, in the dark, there was always a shadow, motionless, no face, no features, just a human-shaped void. That night, Megan came over. She brought something, a clip she had extracted from the most recent live stream. She managed to copy it before the video got deleted, like they always did. But this one was different. The video started the same. Me, or the other me, sleeping. At the 7-minute mark, the bedroom door slowly opened. A man in black walked in, holding a phone, recording. But his face was blurred. Not by editing, but as if the camera itself couldn't capture it. He approached the bed, leaned down, and whispered something into my ear in the video. No audio, but his lips clearly mouthed 3 words. "You're not it." Right then the footage glitched, then cut. Megan and I decided to return to Elmridge. This time, we came prepared, with professional cameras, long-range mics, and infrared lighting. I didn't want to run anymore. I needed to know what it was, and how I had been replaced. When we arrived, the house was locked tight. No way in. But Megan, having worked as a field reporter, found a side entrance through the basement. A rusted steel door, sealed tight. But after some forcing, we made it inside. The basement was freezing, like a walk-in freezer. It reeked of rusted metal and mold. Along one wall was a row of CRT monitors, all switched off. But as we stepped toward the far edge of the room, one of them turned on. I nearly collapsed. On the screen was a live feed from the basement we were standing in. And in that frame, there were 3 people. Me, Megan, and a shadow standing between us. We spun around, no one, but in the monitor, the shadow remained, and with each second, it was becoming clearer. I can't remember if I screamed or just froze like a statue when I saw the shadow standing clearly between Megan and me on the dust-covered CRT monitor. We spun around, flashlight beams cutting through the basement. No one, no shadow, no sound. But on the screen, it still stood there, motionless. I was shaking as I checked Megan's handheld camera. Everything seemed to be working normally, but the lens wasn't picking up the shadow. Only the screen in the basement was showing it, as if the basement itself was the lens. A metallic click echoed behind us. We both spun around, startled. The steel basement door, the one we had used to get in, was now tightly shut. No one touched it. No wind. No reason for it to close. But the handle was now ice cold, and when I tried pulling it open, it was locked from the outside. Megan cursed. I couldn't say a word. We were trapped in a basement with no windows, no phone signal, and no GPS connection. I looked around. Cracked brick walls, old electrical wires oozing with a strange, slimy residue. From the ceiling, a single light bulb flickered erratically like it was about to blow. Beneath it, an old wooden table. And on the table, an 80s-era VHS camcorder. Megan's voice trembled. No way. This thing still works? I approached carefully, making sure not to touch anything else. The power light was on. The tape was rolling. No one had pressed play. We just stood there, frozen, as the machine began replaying the footage on its own. The image was grainy, full of static. The angle was exactly like the original live stream frame, focused on her old single bed, empty, bathed in faint, blue-tinted light. Then, someone walked into the frame. Me. But not really me. It was him. That thing wearing my face. With the twisted smile, the unnatural movements, and eyes that looked like they were patched together from different souls. He stood there, staring directly into the camera, raised a hand, and pointed at me, on tape, in the past. But I felt it, like he was staring through time, through the lens, through every barrier between reality and imitation. Megan began to shake. Cap, he knows you're here. He knows we're watching. A crackling sound came from behind. I turned around. One of the CRT monitors lit up again. It was showing a live feed of the basement, but not the present, the future. I saw Megan standing alone, crying. I wasn't in the frame. Behind her, the shadow was approaching. I screamed, grabbed her hand, and yanked her away from the screen bank. My heart was pounding like a war drum. The air in the basement felt thick, like breathing black fog. We groped our way toward the far end of the basement. There, we found a narrow wooden door, half open, no sign, no lock. I gently pushed it open. A narrow, dim corridor appeared, like the mouth of a cave. Wooden steps descended into deeper darkness. Don't, Megan grabbed my arm. Don't go down there. Cameron, we need to find a way out. Not deeper. I swallowed hard, but the words from the video kept repeating in my head. Not you. If he wasn't me, then who am I? We turned back toward the main door to try breaking the lock. Megan found a rusted crowbar and started prying at the hinges. I stood watch, not realizing the old camcorder was still recording. And then, the sound from the tape changed. Crying, a girl's voice sobbing. But it wasn't coming from the speaker. It was in the basement with us. I spun around. The light bulb above flickered, then went out. Total darkness, and footsteps echoed. Not one, many, not running, not rushing, paced, measured, in rhythm, all around us. Megan called from the door, her voice shaking. Cameron, something's coming. I ran to her. The door hadn't budged. I slammed my fists on it, screamed. Then, a whisper, right beside my ear. Let's switch places. I turned, but no one was there. Only thick, swallowing darkness. But from somewhere, in the ground, the screens, the lens, he was coming. In that exact moment, the door burst open. Megan and I bolted out of the basement like we were escaping hell itself. We didn't look back. By the time we reached the outside, the sun was just beginning to rise. Snow was falling lightly, but on the pristine white ground, there were no footprints, none leading from the house. We drove away in silence, not a word between us. Not until we reached the edge of town. That's when Megan finally whispered, Cam, in the footage, you disappeared. You weren't you anymore. That thing, it's replacing you. I looked at her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She wasn't sure if the person beside her was still me. And honestly, neither was I.